And well, speaking of occupations, tell me about that.
Ever since I was a little girl, I wanted to be a nurse. I was always the one that put on the Band-Aids or gave my grandmother her shots or helped people when they didn't feel well. And I took a test at John Carroll and they told me I was better suited to be a lawyer, which I got a kick out of because that wasn't something I ever really wanted to do, you know. But I guess sometimes your skills might be in one area and you really want to do something else. So, and I think you told me that sometimes people from the nursing career did go into law school for a law degree. But I like nursing.
So what form did your nursing take?
Well, I enjoyed school because it gave you the experience in, like at Sunny Acres for people with tuberculosis, and a psychiatric hospital and medicine and surgery, and I loved the new babies. Worked there one summer, just all with the new babies. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I just loved about that was that there's some of them that are smiling and cooey and happy, and you know, the first day they're born. And there's others that have their fists like this and they're ready to curse at you because something you didn't get right. And I mean, what I'm saying is that babies have their own dispositions that first day, and I just loved working with new babies. And I worked in the prenatal unit, so I liked school, is what I'm saying. Then when I had to make a choice, for some reason at that point, a reason that I do understand, I think, I worked at Hannah Pavilion Psychiatry for a year, and then I went into public health, which I had enjoyed as a student.
Public health means?
Nursing, so that I could drive my car and go give people health care in their homes.
So kind of a visiting nurse.
Mm-hmm. And in that first year, I had a couple of families I just loved. And one of them I wrote an article about and got it published and gave a talk at the American Nurses Association about this family.
Were you, so you wrote an article, well, we'll flesh out more about that in a little bit, but mm-hmm. So you wrote an article about a family you were actually treating. Mm-hmm. And is that where your career remained for the rest of your career?
No, I decided to go try out the schools. And what decided me on that was that I was peripherally, I would say, in the civil rights movement. I mean, I wasn't active in the civil rights movement, but one day I agreed to use my lunch hour with the visiting nurses to go to a picket line that they were having trouble maintaining.
You said they, who were
Congress of Racial Equality had a picket line on the attempts to build a school in a black neighborhood so that the children wouldn't be bused into a white neighborhood. It was an effort to maintain the segregated system in Cleveland at that time.
And where were you living at that time?
I was in Shaker Square at that time in an apartment.
Were you, this goes into our next question, but were you a member of CORE at that time?
Yes, I was a member. And they had an excellent training program, and they insisted on participation in some committee. And the part of the training was how to deal with fire hoses and dogs and how to maintain a picket line. And I really found that very interesting and fun too. So a couple of my friends and I joined CORE together. And I felt like we had learned a lot. We had a young minister teaching us from the Church of the Covenant, and I later learned that they had brought him here specifically to get a CORE chapter started, or to help in the assist in the development of a CORE chapter here in Cleveland. His name was Bruce Clunder.
And so the minister trained you in how to
hold that picket line.
Hold the picket line. Now, I do have a question for you. What does that have to do with, well, let me pause for a moment. I need to adjust your microphone. Now, just a few moments ago, we were talking, Mary, about your occupation.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned that you were a visiting nurse, but that changed. Could you tell me how that changed? Or tell me what changed?
Okay, as I say, I was a visiting nurse and I was active on the picket line. And I saw the minister who had trained us on how to hold a picket line, he got killed that day. And I was just approaching the line and I was hoping that he was still alive. And I took his shoulder and it was like a beanbag. And I realized that he was dead. And the next day, I went down to the Board of Education.
Cleveland Board of Education?
Cleveland, because I'm thinking to myself, this isn't going to work, this kind of activity agitating from the outside. I'll go work on the inside, you know? Mm-hmm. I went to the Corps headquarters that night after that happened, and people came with their guns and their knives, and, you know, okay. So the next day I went to the Board of Education, and that was an interesting experience too, because the woman that interviewed me was amazed I wanted to work on the east side and said I could start tomorrow. Well, I hadn't stopped, I didn't want to start tomorrow, but I did say I would start in September, and I think that was April. So that's really why I started working in the schools.
So you became a school nurse?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, now you mentioned one organization that you were affiliated with back then, and
Mm-hmm.
I'm assuming that was in maybe 60 something?
62, 63, 64, 65 in there.
Okay, and so you were visiting nurse then, and then you became a school nurse. Did you remain a school nurse?
For the better part of 40 years, yes, until I retired.
Were you always working in the schools?
No, I worked as a supervisor in the desegregation team and wrote policy and program development, got quite a bit of funding. And
what was the desegregation team?
this was a team of people brought together to implement the federal district court order for Cleveland.
So Cleveland did have a court case?
Federal district court case, yes.
And this was after you became a school nurse?
Mm-hmm. Yes, it was.
How many years did you say you worked in the school system?
40 years.
So you've retired just fairly recently?
2004.
2004.
2006, pardon me.
Excuse me.
2006. 6 years ago. And I went working in the law office.
We'll talk more about that later. You volunteer in the law office?
I did quite a bit of volunteer work and other things too.
Okay. Tell me some of the other organizations that you were and are affiliated with, including any religious organizations or civic organizations.
When I was in college, I was in the Newman Club, which was a Catholic group on campus, and had a lot of fun with the Newman Club. And it was some of us in what we call the Social Action Committee that joined CORE together. We went over there to the Church of the Covenant and got the training for CORE, and it was kind of a lark because that was like a whole new territory for me. And I didn't know too much about civil rights at all, but began to learn, and my life took a different direction after that.
So you belonged to the Newman Club, which led you to belonging to CORE.
Congress of Racial Equality. Let's see, I've always been active in things like street clubs, a professional organization, the American Nurses Association, and the School Nurse Association when I was a school nurse, and I can't think now, but I'd have to really look at my resume to try to remember, but
as I know you, and you know, a disclaimer here, we know each other quite well.
mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit about your union work?
Oh yeah. I was a nurse, and I'm a hardworking person and a very conscientious person. And in about 1968, the school district decided to balance their budget by firing the nurses.
This is the Cleveland School
The school board in Cleveland. This is before the DSEG case. They were trying to balance their budget, they said. Now, it seemed so wrong to me because you don't just fire a whole bunch of people. I mean, if you want to trim the budget, you look at who's doing well and who's not doing well, and you know, who comes late and all these kind of things. But they just didn't have any sense of that at all. They were not very, I think, not very intelligent. So I got the nurses, we met at our meeting, we signed up, we contacted all kinds of organized labor organizations. And as I say now, that was, what, more than 40 years ago. But we contacted the Teamsters and contacted the international organization that was meeting in Brazil, and went to the inner city Protestant parish, went to the NAACP, went to, of course, to the teachers union. And as chance would have it, the teachers were considering a strike against the board because this board was not behaving intelligently or rationally or fairly at all. And when the national organizers came and talked to me, they said, if I could get the nurses organized to join the strike, that not only would we nurses be accepted into the teachers union, but they would put us on the executive board of the Cleveland Teachers Union. So organizing nurses is like herding cats. They don't want to. They don't know if they should wear their uniform, and they don't think it's professional, and they don't want to be on television when the television cameras come. They all. So, but we did get organized and joined the union, and it was, in those days, we were probably one of the first groups in the country of professional nurses to organize. And that was a great achievement. And I think it led to better performance and enhanced care for kids. Although there's always some...
So you that's one organization, I guess you could say you co-founded the nurses wing of
I think I could say I got that started, yeah.
And what other organizations? I know you've done some other things related to civil rights and housing.
When I joined CORE, I went on the housing committee, and to be perfectly honest with you, I did that because I thought it would be the easiest. I really didn't want to picket, and I didn't want to march, both of which, of course, I ended up doing. The housing committee, all we had to do was go and give a name and say that we wanted a suite. We had 2 kids, and then a black woman would go and Hispanic woman, and then we would see who they accepted. So that's how the housing thing worked back then in those days. I've been on the board of a couple of battered women's shelters, and that's tough work. That's tough work to do, and it's tough to be on the board because stories are terrible, and it happens. I mean, it's real. But I think that what we've been able to do as part of the women's movement is help, battered women to a great extent just by getting shelters open.
And the Rape Crisis Center?
Yes, a founding member of the Rape Crisis Center. Thank you. I had forgotten about that. And there again, well, I'll give you an example. If I can expound a little bit on that, we'll come back to that later.
We'll come back to
okay.
it. I'm thinking now of the list, though, because I've seen your resume, and food co-op and other organizations like that. Can you name a few more?
I can't right now, no, I'm sorry.
Okay. Well, we might get back to it later. Can you tell me your parents' names?
My mom was Agnes Ostendorf, my dad was Herbert Joseph Ostendorf.
And their race and gender?
Caucasian, he's a male, she's a female. Both born, he was born in Cleveland.
Do you happen to know the date?
Of their birth?
Mm-hmm.
No, 1914, 1915, but I'm not sure, no.
That's for your dad?
Yeah, my dad, I think, was the Ides of March, maybe March 15th or so. My mom was the 20-something of May.
And they were married, obviously.
They said they were. Once upon a time, somebody went looking for their. Yeah, they were married.
Are they still with you? Are they still alive?
No, they passed away.
And so it asks here about their the length of time that they lived in the greater Cleveland area. Can you tell? Did they always live in Cleveland?
He was born in Cleveland. I'm not sure where she was born, but I know she went to Notre Dame Academy and lived in the Notre Dame Academy was at that time at Ansel Road in Superior, and she lived on 99th Street there near the school, so she could walk to school.
And your father's education?
He went to Cathedral Latin, I think, in St. Aloysius, and lived in Glenville.
Did they belong to organizations that you recall?
They were fairly active in Jesu Church, where I went to school, and Street Club, and we had a Victory Garden, and my mother was a member of the Singing Bells, the Jesu Bells, and my mom was one of these people like the life of the party. So it was always fun when she went to places, and I always enjoyed it. Whenever I could get to go with them, I enjoyed it.
Did your dad belong to organizations?
He bowled. I think like one night a week he bowled. And he loved boating, sailing. And we fixed a couple of boats in our, I can remember using a screwdriver to put boards in the bottom of the boats. He liked sailing a lot.
Now, it's time for you to tell a little bit about your spouse. I heard you say that you were married in the Superior Court in Washington, D.C. Can you tell me your spouse's name?
My spouse's name is Leslye Maria Huff.
And that would be me.
That would be you.
Spoiler alert, everyone. Can you just describe
I met Leslye.
My gender and my birth date, place of birth.
Leslye was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, March the 3rd in 1950. And I think her mother must have been a wonderful mother, because Leslye is just a wonderful person.
Well, now we're asking, you're making me blush, now we're asking about my education and schooling. Okay,
Leslye is really highly intelligent. She always amazes me at all the things she knows. When I met her, she was working at Harambe Services to Black Families, and she had gotten her bachelor's from Cleveland State. Although she started college in Pittsburgh, she came to Cleveland to finish up at Cleveland State with her bachelor's degree. And and she got a master's. She had a double major when she got her bachelor's degree, and graduate school, and then in the 1990s, she went to law school, and now she's a practicing attorney in Cleveland.
And it asks about current address and my residency, and I know that parallels yours.
Mm-hmm.
Can you say how long we've lived together? And
I met Leslye in 1983, and my life changed.
And so we've talked
And it was we had a commitment ceremony for ourselves that first summer. And I considered myself to be married at that time, although we did not officially get married until it became available to us at the Superior Court in Washington, D.C.
Okay, and now let's talk about children.
Leslye had 2 wonderful boy children, and we raised them together. Let's see, one of them was in school like 8, and the other one was 3, maybe 7 and 3. Khalil was the youngest, and Dawoodi was older.
And did you have children preceding your relationship with Leslye?
I was blessed with a number of foster children, and when I say blessed, I mean that.
How many do you think you've had? How many foster children?
I'm not sure. There again, I'd have to sit down and make a list, but it's been probably, they saw me as being very good at emergency placements, so I had a number of short placements, and some of them you know because they continue, we're in touch, we're in contact. But I'd say less than 10.
And the race and gender of the children?
Male and female, black and white.
So some of these questions that are written here, you can complete in writing.
Okay.
Such as the name, the birthplaces, and whether the children are married, single, or divorced, and that sort of thing. We'll flesh some of that out later. Now, I know you started expanding a little bit on the questions that I was asking you earlier, but now the questions, the interview questions, will get a little bit more broad and probably a lot more deep. Can you tell me about yourself and the history of your family?
Well, sure, I can try. Myself, I didn't realize until I was a teenager that I was adopted. And I loved my family, my adopted family, very much, and they loved me. I have no doubt about that. Never did have any doubt about that. Wanted to meet, really did want to meet my mother and my father, my natural parents, and spent years trying to find them. As I say, I found the doctor who delivered me on West Boulevard. I've been to the house where I was born. If I found my mother, she didn't say so. And I always said if I found her and she didn't want to talk about it, then that was fine too. So I still have some open questions there. And I searched, and they were just starting. In fact, that's one of the things I might have helped with. There are some organizations that help children to find their adoptive parents, and the policies about that have gotten much healthier, I think. It used to be a big secret.
To find their birth parents.
Mm-hmm. So that's kind of a long answer, but it's a very complex issue. And so I wanted to say that. My birth name was, when I went to get my birth certificate, and it was a long, hard process even to get a birth certificate because there was no computers in those days, as you know. my birth name was Faith. And that meant a lot to me, that my mother, who evidently knew she couldn't care for me, named me Faith. I liked that. It meant a lot to me. And I could elaborate more if you want me to.
Well, I think you should tell about yourself.
Well, it's one of the reasons I wanted always to work with children, and I think why I have been a good foster parent. You know, the youngsters have always been able, and I think that I've been able to help them because I know within myself that I have been helped by people just because they cared, you know. So I was telling you about myself. Okay, well, other things. I had diphtheria as a kid, and that ran a high fever for a long time and almost died. And as a result of that, I had bad teeth all my life. Kind of how those things can affect the health for the rest of your life. I had eye surgery several times. I'm going to say 5 or 6 times as a young girl. 4, 5, 6, 7. So I know what it feels like. Eye surgery doesn't feel good. I mean, I'm talking about laying in a bed for a week and your head hurting so much you don't even want to move your toe. The nurse comes the next day and you haven't moved your toe. And then I had amblyopia because of that. So I learned about, I was probably what they would now call, they would probably have given me some kind of special help first, second, third grade because I had all the problems that kids with amblyopia have. And I think what it did to me, it made me just more sensitive to kids, the challenges that children have and that teachers have trying to teach children that come with these things.
Well, tell me about yourself in the context of the history of your family. If you can say a little more about
Well, as I understand it, the Ostendorfs came to Cleveland, and I think there was 8 of them, but I think 3 or 4 of the men and 3 or 4 of the women came to Cleveland. The women never married, and they lived here in East Cleveland for years. And I went to their funerals at St. Philomena's, went to their house quite a bit as a kid. That was kind of one of my stepping out places. I'd just go and visit my aunts. My dad's dad,
and they lived in East Cleveland?
They lived in East Cleveland over by Shaw, by the stadium. In fact, we used to go and park in their driveway and go watch football games at the stadium. My dad's family, my dad's father worked at City Hall as a city planner, laying out streets. But he got cancer and died when my dad was 13 or 14. And my dad quit school, high school, to work to support his mother and his sister.
And that was your grandfather who worked in the city of Cleveland?
Mm-hmm, as a city planner. Mm-hmm. And then there was one of his brothers, spent a good amount of time in New York, and he was the one that made the most money there were 2 of them that made money. One of them had a paint factory, and you met his daughter-in-law, Oral, and the other one was in real estate.
Well, you mentioned that you were adopted. Can you say a little bit more about how that related to your mom and your dad? Your mom in particular, or your dad in particular?
I'm not quite sure. My dad, during the Depression, was working in New York City and dating my mom. And I don't know what.
Well, I was thinking, how did your quest to find your birth parents affect the relationship with your adoptive parents?
It was a challenge for them because I think they felt like I loved them less, or like they wanted to be the center of my world. And I didn't mention to you my two grandmothers, Grandma Ostendorf, who was from Delphus, Ohio, where all the Ostendorfs came from, and Grandma Gear, who walked across the bridge from Canada to Detroit. You know, we have all this about immigration now. She tells very dramatically, when she finished high school, she said she was going to leave home. They lived on a farm. And she walked in Canada all the way to the Detroit Bridge. She walked across the bridge. She talks about seeing signs in the windows there. She wanted to get a job, and there were signs that said, Irish need not apply. She was Irish. Minnie McNerney was her name. And she found her way to Cleveland, and she met her husband, and he managed to make quite a bit of money for a while until the Depression hit. And they had an interesting life together, a very interesting life together. They were interesting. And my grandparents, my grandmothers, were both with me for most of my childhood, and it was, as you know, that can be really an enrichment.
So Minnie McNerney married Mr. Gear,
Mm-hmm.
and when was your mom born then?
I'm going to say again about 1914, but she was adopted also. The Gears adopted her. Minnie McNerney and John Gear adopted Agnes.
And so that's interesting to me that you were adopted, your mom was adopted, and yet they had some difficulty relating to your quest for your...
An interesting piece in there, and I don't even know if I've ever told you this. In her 40s, my mother wanted to contact a blind brother she had in Youngstown, and she advertised in the Youngstown newspaper looking for this brother. And it's kind of ironic because you wouldn't think of advertising in the newspaper for a blind brother, but that's all she knew how to do. She had no contacts, but she remembered this, as she described him, a sibling who was blind, and she loved him so much and she missed him. And I know my father was not happy about that. I'm not sure what all his feelings were, like he didn't want her to make too much contact with that family or whatever. I don't know. I don't know the details except that he wasn't too happy about that. And that was about the same time I was thinking that I would like to meet my natural parents too.
Now, you mentioned that your aunts, and I believe those were paternal aunts, on your father's side, lived in East Cleveland. Tell me, you said you visited them and you'd park and go to the stadium for games.
And I stay overnight there. That was my first overnights that I remember.
Well, what was life like in East Cleveland then?
Well, they lived upstairs in a double house, and the neighborhood was friendly. I used to like their front porch because you could look all the way up and down the street. And one of them was a school teacher, and one of them was a seamstress, and one of them was the homemaker who did the cooking and kept the house going.
So these were the three sisters. Do you remember their names?
Genevieve, I believe, was the oldest. Minnie was the teacher, and Gertrude was the one who kept the house. And one of them had a stroke at our house. They used to come over every Sunday. One of them had a stroke in our living room in Beechwood. And that was the first time I saw anybody have a stroke. And in those days, you put them in the car and took them to where their doctor was, and that was a long drive, and she died. She was dead on arrival at the hospital. That was my first experience with anything like that.
Did they continue to live, the two remaining sisters, did they continue to live in East Cleveland? And did you still visit?
Oh yeah, yeah. It was always fun to go there. I don't know why. I enjoyed it. And as I say, their funerals were at St. Philomena's.
Which is also in East Cleveland.
Mm-hmm.
What do you remember about the city itself in those days?
Usually when we went to the football games, it was because we were going to some Catholic, St. Ignatius or one of the Catholic schools, Cathedral Latin. And what I hear the kids talk about now and what it was like then, it's like two different worlds. I mean, it's like the football games used to be competitive but friendly. You know, there were no fights or anything. What I hear now, when I was a school nurse at Collinwood, sometimes they'd have me go, East High too, just go and be there in case there was a fight, you know, to try to, but we didn't have that in those years when I was a kid.
Injuries too,
Mm-hmm.
not just fights, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, in East Cleveland, do you remember what the community was like, what the neighbors were like in those days?
Not too much, just friendly, nice people.
Your aunts lived upstairs. Who lived downstairs?
I don't know.
And how old were you? I mean, what age range are we talking about?
5, and then visiting and doing things over there and staying overnight. And the aunt who had a stroke at our house in Beechwood, I think that would have been like 1960.
Mm-hmm.
Or before I went to nurses training, 60 probably. So it was and they came to our house every Sunday. And it was just a couple of times a year, really, that I would go and spend a night with them or go do something with them.
But you're talking about, let me see if I have this clear, from the time you were about 5 years old until you were 23, 24?
I had pretty close contact, at least weekly contact with them, yes, the 3 aunts. And then George Ostendorf, George's father, lived in the Tudor Arms, and we used to go and visit them.
Oh, where's the
Tudor Arms used to be a residential hotel at about 107th and Carnegie.
Not in East Cleveland, but on the east side of Cleveland. Can you tell me what your fondest memories of East Cleveland are?
I think I would say from when I was a kid going to those football games at Shaw. Visiting in St. Philomena's, I always liked churches, even at a funeral. And I don't think I went there except for funerals, but I always liked churches. And I always liked going to different churches, even as an adult.
Now, when we were talking earlier about the various places and locations that you've lived, you mentioned that you moved from Cleveland, I believe, to Windermere in East Cleveland. Can you tell a little bit about that time?
That was a rental, and at that time, I didn't think I ever wanted to worry about having a house, so we just rented. But that was then my first foster child, which was an emergency placement because she was at Collinwood High School where I worked. And I think they said she was in a detention home just because they didn't know where else to put her. And they were going to have a strike at the detention home. And the kid was really needing to go to school. So I said I would be her foster mother. And some of the things you don't realize, like the housing inspection for foster mothers, foster care. You have to have a special housing inspection. Do you want to hear all this? This is a long story about housing department.
Frankly, we were talking about fondest memories of East Cleveland, and I went back to your living on Windermere. If I could just step back again,
Mhm.
one more
Mhm.
step. Did you move from Cleveland to East Cleveland?
Hmm.
Where were you living in Cleveland?
There were a group of us that lived in a house on East 87th Street in Cleveland, Ohio. And the effort there was to, it was like community. We were about 5 women, some of whom you have met. And we lived there for a few years through the riots, actually.
Which riots?
The Cleveland, there were some riots.
On Huff? Is
Uh-huh,
the Huff
yeah.
riots you're talking about? So I'm assuming 87th Street was near Huff?
Mm-hmm. Between Huff and Chester, yes. We moved to Windermere.
But why did you live there collectively? I mean, what were you doing?
That's a very good question. There were about 5 of us, and we wanted to be. We all went to St. Agnes Church at that time, and we just decided to live communally and manifest good neighborliness. I mean, I can't.
What does that look like?
We were Catholic. Most of us were Catholic, but the people who later came and joined us were not Catholic.
But what did it look like to manifest good neighborliness?
We just nice. Okay, we had poetry reading every Friday night. We had dinners every weekend.
What kinds of dinners?
Just big dinners.
With community
Invited people, yeah.
And?
And it was a learning experience for all of us. There were people down the street called the Armistads, and they didn't know that their name, was from the Armistad. But I was learning all those things. And this was also during the anti-war movement in Vietnam. And we had a study group. We were, for a while, the place in Ohio where people came to talk about nonviolence. And as you know, later the anti-war movement became somewhat violent, but we were learning about nonviolence, and that led me to Muhammad Gandhi, and to really take a serious listen to King as the strength and the power in nonviolence. That was a whole new concept to me and to many of us in those years. And we had meetings at that house on 87th Street.
I have noticed that you have in a kind of archive photos of those years. Can you talk a little bit about some of the photography that went on there?
I always loved photography. When I was a kid, I had a little black, it's a little black camera. They call it a brownie. And as I got older, I got better cameras, and I always liked to take pictures. Always did. And when we came in this house, I had a dark room in the basement, right under where we are now, and did developing. And when I got busy at work, I took that dark room into East High School, and the chemistry teacher kept it. Because what we found was, they call it iconography. If you get people taking pictures of their environment, it alters the way they see themselves in the environment, and they see themselves more as actors that influencing. So at East High in particular, when I worked there, we did a lot of iconography with kids that were maybe having a little trouble adjusting or something, and then they'd come over here on Saturdays and work down in the darkroom. It's really interesting.
So you moved from East 87th Street.
Mm-hmm.
You said you lived there during the riots.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what was that like?
It was tense, and we couldn't, even to go to work at Captain Arthur Ross School where I was working, I'd have to take buses. I couldn't drive. And if we wanted to leave the area to go to a play or a movie or something, we would have to, the National Guard would put us in a vehicle and take us from the perimeter, because you couldn't bring a car in or out of. And
Why
let me.
couldn't you bring a car in or out?
Well, that was because they had it demarcated as a crisis zone. And I want to say this too, because I think it's important, and American politicians don't understand it. I can remember laying in bed, and I'm a good sleeper, but listening to the tanks going up and down Chester Avenue, and they're young Ohio kids driving those tanks, but you didn't like it. You know, you didn't like having to stop at the border and walk or get one of the Marines or some, it was National Guard, pardon me. That does not work. And when they send the military into these places, it won't work. And I wish they knew that, because they've spent so much money on, and they say a gallon of gas costs $400 in Afghanistan, and we're spending a lot of money on those. And the military, the guys don't know any better, and I'm sorry the generals don't either, because it's just, I mean, I know from that experience, you don't like those soldiers in their tanks up and down the street and with their guns, and you don't like it. If you live there, you just don't like it. Now, you may smile at them and be nice to them and everything, but it won't work.
So you mentioned moving to Windermere. Why did you leave East 87, not 100?
That's a good question. I think a couple of the women that we were with got married. I'm not sure, but we decided, and I'd have to really go back and start talking to some. Judy, who you've met, got married, and there was another girl who got married, and decided it was time to move.
So you moved to East Cleveland?
Yes, and that would have been, I think, just me. See, because people were going, you know how it is when you're young, people get married or go off to get their master's degree or whatever. And the real estate agent who had found the house for us on 87th Street had found a house, had the lead to the house on Windermere. And I lived there for a few years until, as I say, I tried to get a housing license as a foster care. And the woman I was renting from would have had to meet with the housing inspector at the house. And she said, I will never meet with the housing inspector. I will never come there. And I'm telling her, there's just a crack in this one window, but he has to serve you with this, and then you have to, one crack. And I didn't want to move, you know.
So this is the house in Windermere.
Windermere.
And you had the emergency foster daughter, I think.
Yeah, that was Cheryl. You know her, yeah.
Living there, and it had to be certified, though.
Yeah.
So the landlord would not come.
Right. So my friend who was in the real estate business said, well, we got this house over on Windermere, over on Page, and it's a great looking house, but they've condemned it. Now maybe we can get in there and do something with it, and you can move over there. So we got the electricians and the painters and the this and the that, and tried to bring it up to code, and actually moved in. And we're still having trouble getting this license, foster care license. And the man kept coming back and coming back, and there'd be an electrical plug right down by the bed up in the second floor. And then I realized he pushed me in the bed, you know, like he wanted to have sex with me. And I said, oh no. And I'm still trying to get this certification for, well, you know me.
Are you saying that you were attacked?
Yeah, he wanted to have sex with me. So, you know me, I think Celeste was governor then. And I think McCormick was a commissioner. I mean, I called everybody I knew because I wasn't going to get, this man wasn't going to give me the housing inspection I wanted, I guess, unless I did something, of a sexual nature with him, which I was not about to do. And then I realized why the woman that had the house on Windermere, why she was so adamant about she wouldn't meet with any of those housing inspectors. And then later, now, eventually we got the certification for the house, the foster care. But I began to see in the city that housing inspections were done like that. Either you gave them a little money or you gave them a little something. And this guy, the one that had, jostled me to have, give him a little favor, was eventually shot over on Hayden by a woman whose house he was inspecting. And I'm telling that story because I think it's part of what's happened in East Cleveland that's caused deterioration of housing. I mean, housing here is as good as Cleveland Heights or Shaker. It's just that it hasn't been well maintained by the people who are paid to do that, like housing inspectors.
Yeah, it's interesting that you move to ways in which the city has, the next question on my list is ways in which the city has changed over time. And you're talking about a time, let's see, I don't believe Dick Celeste was the mayor, was the governor during that time. That sounds like it was before Dick Celeste. Let's see, because Dick Celeste was in the 80s, so you're talking about 70s, it might have been Governor Rhodes.
With somebody who I knew in Columbus.
But because it sounds like you're saying there's some things that have not changed.
Well, I think, and now remember, I lived in here for another 10 years or so, and then we had the property here as a rental property, so I had a lot of dealings with the housing department after that, and I was a lot more savvy and a lot less gullible. But the housing department, I learned I had to take pictures whenever they came and take pictures of all the work that was done, because they would haul you into court for no reason whatsoever.
Can you...
except they wanted some money.
Can you talk about East Cleveland more generally and tell me about the changes you've seen over time?
Well, East Cleveland used to be a place that people were really, really very proud to live in. And I think there's good reason still to be very proud to live here. And I think the shift has been in the organization of the government, and the housing department is an example that I have experience with. So that's what I mentioned. Now what some of their other departments are doing.
Well, let's talk about the government. When you first moved to East Cleveland, what was the form of government?
Now see, I can't even exactly tell you. I know it's changed over the years. I can't exactly tell you.
Okay. And can you tell me about, you said that East Cleveland was a city that people used to feel proud to live in. And you said that there are still reasons for them to feel proud. Can you tell me why you suspect that fewer people feel proud to live here?
I think that there's been a decline in the value of the housing. I think that the schools are turning out, have not kept up with the pace of change. They're not giving kids what they need. And there's always a few who will do well, no matter what. But the schools haven't met the challenge of the of the day and the time we live in. And I say that as a person who worked in Cleveland at similar schools, you know, to what we have here, like Collinwood and East High. And I know that urban schools can really, really help kids. And I'm sorry that what I see happening here isn't always helpful. In fact, up and down the street, there are more kids that are going to other schools than are going to the public school. And I don't talk at great length with them about that, but I think I know why. Because they just try to do anything they can not to go to these Cleveland schools.
So the schools and housing are two areas where you think could use some improvement.
Mm-hmm.
Now I have a different question. And this question has to do with race and racism. And I'd like for you to tell me how you think race or racism has impacted on you personally, and how has it impacted on the city of East Cleveland. But first, about you.
I've had a long journey in coming from Beechwood and growing up in University Heights in Beechwood to understand about race and racism in the United States of America. And that included some time in Africa, in Ghana, watching the news with the Ghanaians and hearing them talk about the United States of America. And in that way, East Cleveland is just a microcosm of the struggle. And again, schools are extremely important to help get to college or get to careers, and housing is important. I've been blessed in my life, I think, like it, you know, with my adoptive parents, and when I was in school with my amblyopia and my difficulty, I also had some speech problems, but I've always been blessed that people came along to help me. When I was in elementary school, it was the bus driver. And what he would do is, and I didn't take the bus every day because I was on the fourth bus, which made me late for school every day, but when I was with Leonard, he would imitate my speech, and I learned from Leonard that my speech wasn't normal. And so I learned to, and it's been similar with race. People have kindly helped me to understand things about race, and I don't think I've ever had too much bad treatment, you know.
No, I don't know. Explain. Excuse me.
Well, sometimes when a white person is in an all-black environment, they can catch some prejudice. It does happen, but I've been lucky. I haven't. Like an example I'll give is the day that Martin Luther King was killed. I went from the school that I was working at, and we had early dismissal. And I went up to the Newman Club in University Circle walking, and then I walked home, and that was on a Friday. And we had a poetry reading that night, and I was kind of worried. I really was kind of worried because people were very, very angry, you know, when Martin Luther King was killed. But we had a good meeting, a good poetry reading that night, and everybody talked about their feelings, and shared in the feeling of tragedy, that something, I think people were afraid that something terrible was going to happen, like people were going to start killing each other. But we talked about it that night.
Who was the we?
the poetry group that we had, the people that came Friday night, they all wrote poetry. And
this is when you were living on East
87th Street. Mm-hmm.
Were these, can you tell me the racial?
Some of them were from college kids from the Newman Club. The Newman Club, that could be, and then there was one Filipino fellow that worked at went to school at Case and then worked at Case, and then some other people from the Newman Club, some people from the neighborhood, like you've met Don Freeman. Norma used to come occasionally. People who like to write poetry or read poetry. That's what it was. It was a poetry reading.
And what was the racial component of those people?
The Newman Club people that we knew, and then people from the neighborhood. Black and white, half and half like.
And so the question was, how did racism impact you personally? Would you like to say a little more about that?
I don't think so, not right now.
Okay. How has it impacted the city of East Cleveland?
Okay, I would say this, I'll say this about racism. When I was in Africa, I was with people, the kids would come and want to touch me, you know, because they hadn't touched white skin. And I realized that I was tense with some African people. And what it was me. I had to look at myself. One example is people who had scarification on their face, like tribal markings. And then when I came here, we sponsored an African Niai Ankara, and they lived here on the 3rd floor. And they were well received, I think, in the neighborhood here. Now the neighborhood, when I first came here, was mostly white, and through that, 40-year period, it's now mostly black.
You're talking about the street we live
Mm-hmm.
on now,
Mm-hmm.
Page Avenue.
Mm-hmm.
When Niai came to East Cleveland, that was what year, please?
It was in the 70s. I can't tell you exactly what year. It was in the 70s. It was in the early 70s because I went to Cuyahoga Community College with him. He needed to take some classes so he could go to John Carroll. And I took statistics so I could go to graduate school at Case Western. And I think he took chemistry. So I took him to class, and I would go to class too. And I started.
So he was a Ghanaian person that you brought to Cleveland,
Mm-hmm.
to East Cleveland, I should say. And so you're talking about the early 1970s?
Yes.
And the street was mostly white?
Yes, I think I could say that. Now, some of our neighbors, like neighbors that are even still here, George and his wife Linda moved in about the same time I did. And next door to us, the other way, there was a family, a black family who had a grocery store over on Hayden. They lived next door to us. They didn't stay though. But I think the majority was white then, I think.
And so, I know the question of race and racism is not an easy one to discuss, but it is an important one, what we are working on. So I'm going to go back and ask again if you have anything else you'd like to add to your statement about racism and its impact on you personally.
I was working at Collinwood High School and living here. Collinwood High School was very tense. I know, and I was the nurse. They put me there full time. I asked them, why did you put me here full time? Most schools didn't have full-time nurses. The answer I got from my supervisor was to keep the blood up off the floor. I mean, it was like that.
And what period of time are we talking about?
This would have been, again, in the early 70s. Before I went to graduate school. That was a break. Now, some of that same stuff was going on here at Shaw, but I didn't go there every day. I went to Collinwood, if you know what I'm saying. So I can't exactly testify as to some, but some of the same stuff was going on here.
And what was the stuff going on in Collinwood?
But in Collinwood, then you have to look at the there was at Collinwood what they called like the mobs, Italian groups that formed mobs, and they did tend to just kind of gel together, and it made the halls of Collinwood sometimes not safe, really.
So there were gangs in the school?
Yeah,
Is that what you're
yeah. And I can't testify to what happened here. Because I don't know, I wasn't at Shaw, for instance, in those years.
But you were dealing with racism personally, and that's what my question was about.
I'm going to have to give that some thought. I'm not quite sure how to.
Okay, we can come back to it. How has inequality impacted on you personally?
Well, the world isn't fair. I don't know what I can say about that.
Okay, I'm going to take a break.
Mm-hmm. I thought that.
Now, we were talking yesterday about some of the organizations that you were affiliated with, and you said you wanted to refresh your memory by looking at your resume or whatever. Have you had a chance to think about some of the organizations and activities you were a part of?
In the 60s, I talked about the Newman Club and CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, Diversity House, which was a arts house that we founded. We had a poetry group too. Newman Club. And that was in the 60s. In the 70s, Ichabod Llewellyn, who was the director of the African American Cultural and Historical Society, invited me onto his board. And as we were getting to know each other, his house was near a school I worked at. And I remember making a home visit there and talking with him. And then I invited him here for a dinner one night. And he told me the story. I told him I was working some of the anti-war and peace movement type things, the peaceful part of the peace movement. And so he told me about the D-Day invasion that he had been a part of. And I was a little bit surprised because he didn't seem like a very warlike man to me. And he said, oh yes, he had a rifle and he was on one of those boats that made the landing at Normandy. but he said when he got off the boat, he forgot his rifle. And he said he made it up the shore and looked for the highest hill that he could get to, and he sat up there for a couple of days and watched the war. And it's a great story, and if you knew Llewellyn, it's the story of a historian. You know, he was in the middle of it, but he was still observing it more than participating in it. He was a fascinating man. He worked at Case Western, and I never was quite sure what he did, but he was a really interesting man. And
you served on his board?
I served on his board, and I learned then that sometimes it's difficult, the difficulties of a director who was the founding director of an organization. It presented some challenges, but it was illuminating and a wonderful experience. And of course now his museum is at the East Cleveland Library, and I'm very glad for that.
At least part of his collection, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Were you aware that they're trying to reestablish the African American Museum?
No, I wasn't aware of that, but I'm glad.
So that's one of the organizations that you were affiliated with in the 70s.
Mm-hmm.
What else did you participate in the 70s?
Well, I had gone to Africa either in '69 or '70, and that kind of changed my worldview. I wouldn't say changed it, but enlightened it. And one of the things I said when I got back, as I was there, when I was there looking at the news on Black Star Radio, television, I said, when I get home, I'm going to be more active. Got back home, and Kent State jumped off. So then I joined the Medical Committee for Human Rights. And at that time, what the Medical Committee for Human Rights did was they had doctors and nurses going and really taking pictures. That was we weren't really medical, if you know what I'm saying. They had discovered that when things jumped off, oftentimes we didn't have the evidence that we needed. So I went around taking pictures and established the darkroom in the basement here in this house. So I had a 35mm camera and a darkroom here in the basement. And again, it's another eye on the world that when you get involved with things like that. I wish I had had a camera earlier in the 60s, but I hadn't thought of that, and the movement wasn't sophisticated enough to have a group of people whose responsibility was just to go and take pictures. In the 70s, I had become active in the Cleveland Teachers Union organizing school nurses when we got fired by the Board of Education. The board members were really not very smart people. They did some stupid stuff. One of them was firing the nurses. I organized the nurses, and organizing nurses is like herding cats. It's really, really, really a challenge. But they gave us the impetus by firing us, so people were willing to give it a try. And shortly after that, the Cleveland Teachers Union went on strike, and national labor people came in and promised the nurses that if we fully participated in the strike, that they would give us a place on the executive board of the Cleveland Teachers Union. And we put a sign, actually I put a sign in Abe Lincoln's hand. Now Abe's standing there like this in front of the Board of Education up on about a 7 or 8 foot pedestal. And it was so tiring all day long. They gave us the Board of Education. Of course, most teachers, they told them stay at their building, just put up a little picket line there. But they gave us,
the nurses.
Yeah, and they were the local people were challenging us. Can they do this? Can they do this? So one of the things, I had trouble getting people out at 5 or 6 in the morning. So a coach showed up, a guidance counselor from John Hay, big fella, and I crawled up on his shoulders and up on the pedestal, and up, I was standing on Abe's toes, grabbed his knee, and they handed me a strike sign and some tape, and I wrapped this on strike sign around his hand. Well, this was still in the days when there were 3 broadcasts every day, NBC, CBS, and ABC. That night, it was national news, Abe Lincoln, and when they teach strike strategy, I understand that they're still using that as one of the ways of turning public opinion, informing people. That was on the national news that night. And at the teachers union, they couldn't believe the nurses had done that. They just couldn't believe it.
Well, now, you said that you belonged to a medical group that actually became witnesses by taking photos. Did that inform or lead to your work at the Rape Crisis Center or the women's shelters, battered women's shelters?
I think the Rape Crisis Center and the women's shelter board memberships were both because of my work in the schools with children. I don't think that I mentioned the photography work, but that was really kept on the low. They didn't talk too much about that. I didn't talk too much about it. I had my little dark room here, and no, I don't think that was a lead into that. I think it was because of my work with children.
And how did your work with children create your interest in being on the Rape Crisis Center board?
Well, because I had seen it happen. I had heard youngsters, and I didn't know how to handle it. I didn't know how to I mean, there's a technique to interviewing and all this, and this was in the 70s, and I did not know, and was pretty frank about saying I didn't know how to approach this kind of, how do you talk about this with the kids? And I kept talking to people about it, and actually it was through the inner city Protestant parish. The woman I worked with there wanted me to come on the board because she said that's the kind of thing we're trying to develop across the country. Oh, in the emergency room, I was working in the emergency room, and I can't quite put all this together, but they wanted to get the protocol for emergency rooms, and I've got a couple of stories about that too, where even an examining physician wouldn't certify rape, you know, when you could see the grass on the woman's back, you know. I mean, I had a couple of really confrontations with doctors where you could see, you know, she was pushed down on the ground, her thighs are bruised, she's got grass on her back like she's, but there was no protocol. And that was one of the things that we worked on with that was one of the first things we worked on with the Cleveland Rape Crisis Center after we got our 501c3 and those, you know, elected a board and those kind of things. And that was in the 70s. And I'm sorry if I go on, I have these little spurts of memory that...
Well, I'm glad about them. I'm looking here at your other affiliations from the 60s, and you also have Battered Women's Shelter written as one of the places that you began to...
I was on 2 of those. And one of them is on the west side, and I was told that the Celeste provided the house on the west side for that shelter.
By Celeste, you mean?
The Dick and his wife.
Dick and Dagmar?
Dick and Dagmar, yes. And the one on the east side was at Harkness, near Huff. Oh, okay.
Okay. I'm not sure whether those places still exist or not, but we probably shouldn't say their locations. The League's Park Center Board, what was that?
League Park, L-E-A-G-U, or League Park. League Park had been a baseball stadium before there was a Cleveland Stadium where they played baseball at Lexington and, let's say, 71st near Addison. Now 71st is Martin Luther King, so maybe 73rd. And there was a stadium there and a baseball diamond, and I guess what you would call the clubhouse, and where they came in, where they took tickets at the corner of Lexington and the side street. And that became League Park Centers as a neighborhood center. And Cleveland is famous for developing those neighborhood centers in the neighborhoods of Cleveland. Goodrich, Gannett, and many of them. And I have been told that that's one of the things that's unique about Cleveland is the active neighborhood centers. Don Freeman headed that up.
But didn't you mention him before when you were talking about your poetry center?
Norma, his wife, came to our poetry readings
Uh-huh.
and participated. Don I knew a little bit from when I was in college, because we were in college together. Of course, I was in nursing and he was in probably education. I imagine education, I don't know. So I remember him, and he's a memorable character, you know. He may not remember me from those days, but I do remember him. And then he walked over here and we sat on the front porch and he asked me to be on the board as the treasurer. And I wasn't sure I had the skills to be treasurer, but I said, sure, I'll try. And people who know Don well know that he is a meticulous, to the penny organizer. Everything is super organized. And I never had an easier job in my life. And he's also honest beyond belief. So it was one of the easiest board positions I ever had, because there was always perfect clarity between the bank reports and the requests for funds and the projection for the year, and I didn't have to do much of the work at all. He actually did most of it. So I was their treasurer for a number of years, and came to have great admiration for Don and his wife Norma. Norma and I had lunch a few times and, you know, got to know each other, but Don and Norma Freeman are people I'm glad I know.
So you served on that board, and then as we moved toward the 80s, and it's very interesting to see the progression of activities, of organizations.
Mm-hmm.
Here in the 80s, you are still working very hard with the Cleveland Teachers Union.
I was on the executive board of the Cleveland Teachers Union for a few years, the first nurse representative for a few years. But at this time then, the federal court was having hearings on the desegregation efforts of the district. Mm-hmm. And I was hearing about the plan they were making, and I was thinking I didn't much like it, because they had people designing the plan that didn't know much about the school district. But so, I mean, that's the way life is sometimes. But then the court, Judge Battisti, made a finding, and there was a department set up for desegregation, and some of the funding was from the state, and that was something that he helped with. It was very helpful to the city, I think. So as I had at one time in my life gone down to the Board of Education to apply to be a nurse, I went down there to apply to be on the deseg team. And I told them some stories. It was really interesting when you think about applying for jobs. I told them about the picket line where Bruce Clunder had been killed and how I felt that had changed the direction of my life. And the people that interviewed me, it was amazing. And then I told them about a couple of my experiences in the schools where I felt children, especially high school children, weren't treated fairly.
Was this before or after your tenure at Collinwood?
Actually, I was at Collinwood, because that was one of the stories I told them. I told them I'd gotten a call I was at Collinwood, and when I asked why I was there full time, my supervisor said to keep the blood up off the floor. I mean, that was supposed to be the rationale. And I think I know I made a positive contribution there, and that was where I was to become my first foster child, Cheryl.
Now, you said you made a positive contribution at Collinwood. What kinds of things did you do that were a little different?
I had a health careers club, and a lot of those kids went on to become doctors. One of them said to me, I want to be a pediatrician, and I was amazed, because most high school kids don't identify what kind of a doctor they want to be. She's a pediatrician today. Mm-hmm. Veterinarian, medical technology, it's amazing how many of them went on and did what they said they were going to do. And then I also had a Bible study that met in the morning at 7:30 in the nurse's office. And that was very interesting. He said what I was doing with both clubs is finding things that black and white students could come together on and share about. And one of the things I learned at that time was how well so many of the black kids knew that Bible inside and out. And I think the white kids that came to the Bible study were also, you know, impressed with the knowledge. And it kind of opens those little doors that help. And then the kids know each other. When the bells ring or when a fight breaks out, they know each other because they've been in a Bible study at the nurse's office. And that was, it's interesting, that was controversial because it was, and I'd just say, well, we have it before school starts, you know, and so nobody said too much, but there were a lot of questions raised. Also, one of these issues, I got this call from a Florida college, a guidance counselor at a Florida college, and the woman asked me, had so-and-so,
one of the students
missed so much school because she had syphilis. And I was immediately, of course, surprised, and of course I shouldn't even have a conversation like that, but I said, who? And I said, well, this is kind of a difficult conversation for me. Why are you asking me? And she said, well, we're contemplating giving her a scholarship, and I have to check out all the information that's given to us. So when I heard the word scholarship, I said, well, when you mention the word syphilis, a number of names come to my mind of youngsters who could, you know, that I would consider maybe that could happen. This youngster is not one of those students at all. I know her. She's in every club, she's in every organization, she's very proud of her academics. She's one of the academic people. She was a helper of mine, actually. I wouldn't see her, that whatever information you got, I'm quite sure is not correct.
So what do you suppose prompted?
Well, then she went on and told me the rest of the story, which is that she had gotten a call from a guidance counselor at the school, and she gave me the woman's name. So I'm interviewing for this job to be on the DSEG team, and I told them the whole story.
Now, look, again, if I can unpack that a little bit, are you saying that the guidance counselor is white and the student is black, a black female? Oh my goodness. So what it appeared to you that the guidance counselor was trying to sabotage the scholarship?
The scholarship.
My goodness. And so that's one of the other stories that you told when you were being interviewed.
Being interviewed. The interview went on for a long time.
I bet it did.
But I had all this kind of like first-hand, you know, experience, so I told them about it.
And what happened as a result?
Well, I was hired, and they gave me, I think I chose my own title, which was Supervisor of Human Resource Utilization, because I wanted to bring human resources into the school for the kids, and that was new. That had not been done under Paul Briggs. There was always kind of a block.
And Paul Briggs
and
was?
The previous superintendent.
Of schools, yeah.
And the other thing I did was crisis intervention. When things were looking tense, they would send me to investigate and then try to bring some of these community resources to bear if it was appropriate.
So by human resources, you were talking about community resources, community...
Suicide prevention, rape crisis, Harambe services to black families, neighborhood centers, people, organizations that I had known, and we had a monthly meeting to just brainstorm. And we had students came to that meeting from the Law and Public Service Magnet High School.
So this was during your period of being on the DSEG unit?
And by now we're into the 80s.
And so we're sort of, what I'm seeing here is that the organizations that you affiliated with also became your resources in your effort to ameliorate some of the problems in the school system. We're going to go back to that, what did you call it? Monthly meeting.
Okay.
We're going to go back to that a little later. But we were finishing up with the organizations. Now we've gotten to the 80s, and what I see on your list here of the 80s is something called Egg Moon Farm. No, I'm sorry, I misspoke. In the 80s, I see, I see something a little odd called Black Magic Rainbow Productions. Can you talk about that?
I was a member of like the steering committee for Black Magic Rainbow Productions, and that had been founded by Leslye Huff, and trying to bring and expose talent of black women, black lesbians, to the greater Cleveland population of lesbians.
Well, yeah, and I can speak to that a little bit. The Black Magic Rainbow Productions was at an experiment, actually, in trying to bring all the different cultural backgrounds of a variety of different people to bear.
Hence the rainbow.
Yes, not just African American people, but if you recall some of the others that were participants in the organization, they came from all kinds of backgrounds, including indigenous people and Asians and Jewish people and the like. Well, let's move on to the 90s. I see here that in the 90s you began to work. That's Egg Moon Farm. Can you describe Egg Moon Farm and what
It was a
means?
collective group of women bought a piece of property in Holmes County, Ohio, and went there for retreats, basically, and put up our tent and made our campfire and got to know each other better and told stories and did things like bringing your mother. And we had golf carts, so that like with your mother who wasn't able to get around real well, we had a golf cart that we could take her to different, it was several hundred acres as I recall it. And it was just a chance for women to get together and tell stories. And
You had something, you have Egg Moon Farm / Land Fest.
that again was Holmes County, and that piece of property that we were.
So you'd have festivals,
Yeah.
is that what that was?
And camping and.
And then as we move into the year 2000, you still have the Cleveland Teachers Union. Now, you said that you left.
There'd been a hiatus there when I was with administration. And I might say the federal district court, because I was a supervisor, they offered me principalships and other positions. But as I've told you, in my heart I always wanted to be a nurse. And I said I'd like to go back to being what I was before, a nurse. And they were surprised that I didn't want to be a principal or
So this is
So I came back to be a nurse in the Cleveland Teachers Union, and for a few years then I was elected again as their representative on the executive board of the Cleveland Teachers Union. And by now we had a good hookup with the national level of organizing health workers, and so it was like another chapter of organizing health workers. And the Cleveland nurses had been the first. And it was beset with problems because hospital nurses don't want to model themselves after school nurses, and intensive care nurses don't. Each different group has its own unique challenges. But I was proud to be a part of that too.
Well, during your time in the DSEG unit, if I'm hearing you correctly, you were officially in administration
Yes.
rather than rank and file
Right.
workers, and you said there were two different basic parts of your job description, if you will. One was
There were three actually. Program development was one.
like the homeless. I developed a homeless program because I discovered there were so many kids missing school because they were homeless. So they might go to South High School, but they were living in Euclid, Ohio. So we just developed a homeless committee to try to, if not just strategize, can we get this, a senior in high school, can we get a taxi to carry him back and forth so he can graduate? Can we have youngsters at shelters or in neighborhoods with a motel, or what? Can we get them transportation? Can we? So and ours was the first in the country and the best for a few years in there of a homeless project for school-age children. And that was program development. That's an example of program. The other thing I did was crisis intervention, and that's how I discovered that we had so many homeless kids. And then the other thing that I did was networking with the not-for-profit organizations in the community to try to bring them in a constructive way to help in the schools. Or, if not to help in the schools, to give us some good ideas about things that the district could do to help students.
Was the Shoes for Kids program part of your programmatic work? And that also was a piece of the organization, because that was an organization outside of the schools.
Right, that would be an example of trying to utilize an outside organization and bring their resources into the schools. And can I tell you a little joke?
I'm afraid of your jokes, but go on.
Well, you know, you have these reports for the bureaucracies. And I put on my report that Shoes for Kids had provided 40,000 shoes. And a few weeks went by, and Mr. Sayer, who was the founder of the organization, said, you know, I met with Al Tutela the other day, and he wanted to know, did we give out 40,000 pair of shoes in the Cleveland Public Schools during that month? And I said, what'd you tell him, Maury? And he said, I told him, I don't know. I don't count the shoes myself. I said, okay. He said, do you know? And I said, I think it was 20,000. But see, what I had done was said 40,000 shoes.
Not pairs of shoes.
And I was wondering, like you do when you're making reports, does anybody ever read this? I said, let me just see. Because somebody will ask a question if they read it. So Al, the superintendent, contacts Maury Sayer, who comes to me. So I said, somebody's reading the reports. And that's the first time I've ever told anybody about.
Well, still 20,000 pairs of shoes is an awful lot of shoes to give out.
It is.
And it's amazing the work that
was done. That was a beautiful linkage, and that's what I love about synergy, when you put it together and bring good feeling to people, to their principals. I mean, that was work for those principals to have 100 crates of shoes come in, and they had to fill out orders for them. And that's when I learned the computer, how to put boys and girls shoes, 12 different sizes, and that all had to be computerized, and I had to do that. That was when I learned about spreadsheets, and that would have been like 1984, and I had to do all that myself.
Now, what's interesting is that you were this one-person department.
Doing all these, yeah.
Yes, and you had all of these different. Now, this monthly meeting that you mentioned, are you aware that most people called it a think tank because it was an effort to solve some of the problems? But you'd never called it that.
I'm not sure. I may have. I don't know who dreamed it up. It might have been the kids. The students loved it.
So you had, now who came to these meetings?
We had students from the Law and Public Service Magnet High School. Neighborhood Centers Association, various people. Gail Long at that time was on the west side, and Don Freeman would often send someone. Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts would send someone. Rape Crisis Center, of course, sent somebody, because if I wasn't still on their board, it hadn't been long. NAACP would usually send somebody. And it might have been the woman who's now a judge.
Oh,
She might
Judge Tarver.
might have been her, but they sent someone. And what would happen is if there was a
I'm thinking, what about see, I know all these stories about you, and so it's hard to interview you without recalling some of the stories. I'm thinking now about your mediation efforts, because was that one of the programs that came out of your...
one of the programs that I linked with was the West Side Mediation Program, and that was a neighborhood mediation program, and I'm going to say in the neighborhood of about 40th and Clark, and I believe it came out of one of the neighborhood centers over there. And I said, I wish we could do this in the schools. I really wish. Well, they were setting up the Lawn Public Service Magnet High School, and I went over and talked to the principal and my supervisor, of course. Can we try to get training, staff training? They had to fill up, they had like 100 hours of staff training at the Lawn Public Service. I said, can we bring the trainers, because that's one of the things they did with the West Side Mediation Program, to do the training at the Lawn Public Service Magnet. And I have always said, to me, the most important piece of mediation, and there's different methods, but the piece about listening is so important. And if you don't, and it was like a 14-hour curriculum, but I kept saying, if you don't do anything else, well, the faculty loved it. They really found that interesting. And then they trained the newly elected student council at the Lawn Public Service Magnet, wrote a grant, got some money to train students to go out to this within a year or two, we had a mediation program in every school in the district. And I remember I had put down as a goal, you know, you do your annual goals and objectives, to get mediation into every school. And I remember my supervisor saying, are you in every school in the district? Are you in I said, I'm really not sure. Give me a couple of days and I'll go check, because I mean, there's always some principal who will say, no, we don't want that here, or no, we don't have time, or our curriculum. Well, I did go and put out the feelers and made some phone calls, and there was some mediation program in every school in the district, and these had been begun by the Lawn Public Service Magnet high school students who had been trained, and they were under the direction of Carol Close at that time. It was really beautiful. And it reflected in statistics. We didn't have the fighting and the shooting and the stabbing. The first incident we had of a youngster being killed was all the way through all DSEG, and it was a new school that was set up, and they didn't have it at the new school. And there was a shooting there. And so, by this time, I was gone. The department, our work was finished. The department was gone. And so that school hadn't had a team. There were a lot of beautiful stories that came out of that mediation program.
I know that Carol Close was one of the project leaders of the mediation program throughout in the Cleveland Public Schools through her work at the Lawn Public Service Magnet. And I can almost quote her as saying that you were the founder, or the establisher of that.
We used to joke about that she was the mother and I was the grandmother. When we started that, she was off on a maternity leave having a baby. So we got it started before she came back, but she came back in then with new energy, and as often happens then.
Well, there was another peace movement kind of person that came to your round table or think tank on a fairly regular basis. Her name is Ruth Begun, and I do recall meeting her at that gathering.
Ruth had a not-for-profit corporation for peace, and she had come from Germany, she and her husband, and they were really dedicated to peace. And she came to every meeting. And as I understand it, the organization is still in existence, and they're still functioning at some level. I'm not quite sure exactly how. She lived in East Cleveland, Ruth Begun.
Well, now, you were living in East Cleveland while all of these interesting things you were doing in the city of Cleveland. Did any of them translate into work in East Cleveland?
Well, as I say, Ruth Begun lived in East Cleveland, and we used to talk about, like, especially the schools, was there anything that we could do? And frankly, I had my hands full with what they were paying me to do there in Cleveland. And I was hearing things a lot, like in East Cleveland, 1 out of 3 of the males from Shaw High School end up in the penitentiary. I mean, I was hearing this kind of stuff because we talked about it. People talk about, in Cleveland, in the schools, how you can.
What decade are we talking about here?
Like 80s.
So that long ago, we were already getting those kinds of
stats.
Stats.
And Ruth Begun was like, she would spend all day on the phone trying to. She had a heavy German accent, so I often imagine what she ran into when she called it stone walls when she tried to do things here as a resident of the city.
Now that brings me back to a subject that you demurred on earlier when we were talking, and the first question I asked you where that happened had to do with race and racism. So I'm going to ask you that question again. You probably had some time to think about it. How has race and racism impacted on you personally?
Well, I told you my life was changed when Bruce Klender was killed. I tried to report that as a crime to the Cleveland police by dialing Main 1234, because I left the scene there and I had 5 or 6 patients to see that day, and at each place I found a telephone and tried to call the police. And what the police used to do at that time is say, why don't you get a job? I mean, well, no matter what you said, if it was about something like that that had to do with civil war, get a job, get a job. That was their answer. I made my way to a captain the next day, get a job. So it's that dismissive attitude that interferes with law enforcement.
So you equated Bruce Klender's death with a race-based activity.
And the failure to follow up on they didn't even have a hearing. You know, and I don't know criminal law well enough, but I know there should have been a hearing or an indictment or something, grand jury, there was nothing. And, well, then the other thing is within my family. I was kind of disowned in some ways because, and I have to say it was their racism, because what I was doing was certainly, I think, highly ethical. But my mother and dad were uncomfortable with my activities, and so were a number of the other relatives. And so you'd end up getting people changing their wills and such. So that's racism. You know why they've done it, and that's racism, and that's that. And
you were called some names
keep on going.
That kind of thing, weren't you?
Like nigger lover? Yes, that's been said to me a number of times, not by my relatives, but by police in different circumstances. Like one of the things they had us to do with the Medical Committee for Human Rights was if somebody was stopped, you stop, get your camera and go and stand in the street. And yeah, I got nigger lover a couple of times from the police officer. And I just take a couple of pictures and leave. I mean, I was never arrested or anything, but of course I know how to tiptoe when it's necessary too, and try not to be too abrasive. But that was the kind of thing they wanted us to do.
So, your family. Can you say a little more about that? I don't have a specific
and it
question.
took me a while to figure out, and I'll give you an example now. You knew Oral Ostendorf, her husband, George. They gave me a car when they moved to Hawaii. They gave me their car.
And when was this, in the 70s?
70s, yeah. And
when Leslye Huff, I sponsored him when he came to work to finish. He went to community college in John Carroll and got his PhD from Cleveland State. And I let him use that car. And then...
Wait a second. Leslye Huff, who is that?
He was a student that I met when I went to Africa. And Mary Mason and I sponsored him to come to the United States. And then he went to the Cuyahoga Community College and John Carroll University and Cleveland State University.
Where did he live?
Here, upstairs. And he brought a wife here, and they had a number of children, and they're back home in Ghana now. And he had a very important position in the government in Ghana.
Now he does. So you brought him to Cleveland,
Mm-hmm.
or to East Cleveland,
Mm-hmm.
and he lived with you on the third floor. Now, make the connection between him and your aunt or cousin, Oral.
Okay, they gave me a car. When they moved to Hawaii, they gave me the car they had been using. And then I, in turn, gave it to him to use. Now, he went to community college. When the first semester or two, I drove him back and forth, and I took a couple of classes then, too. Statistics classes at the community college. And then he went to John Carroll. You know, he needed a car. Well, he had an accident up here on Terrace Road. It was not his fault, but somebody hit him and the car was totaled. And in my honest self, I called Hawaii right away and told them that the car had been totaled and what wonderful things the car had done to provide him with transportation for while he was working on his bachelor's and his PhD, and worked at Cleveland Clinic. And well, evidently my Uncle George was really not happy that I had let this fella use the car. And
why was
it had to be racism. I mean, why else would... They're in Hawaii. They didn't need the car anymore. They gave it to me. I used it, but then I shared it too, you know. And so he said, oh, he never wanted Mary to have any bit of their money in their will and this and that and the other. And I guess he went on quite a bit about that, but I didn't hear about it till long after his death. In fact, when he died, we had his ashes came back here. We had a mass said for him at Jeju, and we went and we buried him. And I didn't realize all this other stuff was going on with where his racism was taking its wrath on me because I let Leslye Huff use the car. Yeah, it's like that.
The questions that you had for your family around race and racism, can you talk a little bit more about those questions that, you know, as a young person, did you ever probe them and their feelings about race and racial issues?
Yeah, I made it a habit of going around and asking people why they didn't like black people. Now this is when I will mostly say when I was in high school is the age I would give. My high school friends, the guys I dated, the people in our neighborhood, why don't you like black people? And then after college, when I had more contact with black people, I was asking them why they didn't like white people. And I used to talk about this of probably hundreds of people I asked. There were only two what I thought were halfway reasonable answers. And one was a black guy who said that he had seen his uncle lynched. And he talked about that with me at great length. I mean, this was in the 70s. And it sounded like he hadn't talked to anybody about it, and it was like, I didn't ask anybody else after that. I just stopped asking the question because I figured people have their reasons. And the other guy was a white guy who had been in Vietnam, and he had had what he called a bad experience with
with a black soldier who didn't, as he said, cover my back. Now, I don't know what that was all about, but at least it was a reason. An awful lot of people have animus, and they can't exactly look in you in the eye and tell you why. You know, so I went around bothering people with this question, including my family. And they didn't know anybody. They didn't know anybody black. They really didn't. My dad had his prejudices, but I would say his was like Polish people. Guys that came to work at the factory that were Polish and didn't speak much English.
You mentioned that when your grandmother, your maternal grandmother, came across
the bridge,
she saw signs that said Irish need not apply. Did that translate at all into a different kind of attitude?
It did. Grandma Gear was, Minnie McNerney became to me Grandma Gear. And she would say to me all the time, what color is your blood? And I'd look at and I'd say, well, blue. No, your blood is red. And she'd say, you know, we all have colored blood. And I remember my mother saying to her, you shouldn't tell her that. But my grandmother would say, we all have colored blood, of course. And I think my grandmother was probably, as I look back now, I can say she may be the one who, for one reason or another, and it might have been that experience with Irish Need Not Apply, who had examined the issue and wasn't racist in the way that most white Americans are. She was, and I remember going to Boston and I applied at a number of different nursing schools, Georgetown, St. Louis, one of the schools in Boston. And this came up. I think it was about, maybe on the questionnaire, it was about race. And this older woman was interviewing me. And I said, well, we all have colored blood. And she said, honey, I wish you wouldn't say that. I said, well, it's true. And my grandmother used to tell me that. She said, honey, I just wish you wouldn't say that. And I think she was telling me, you will run into prejudice. You know,
people will assume that you
have colored blood.
That you're African.
Colored blood, yeah. So yes, those.
So with those kinds of attitudes in your world, how did that impact on? It sounds like you had a fairly large number of African Americans in your grown-up environment.
In my grown-up environment. Let me tell you, one other thing happened that helped my mind. I wrote a paper on identification with the aggressor. That helped me. Because the puzzlement was, okay, we had a German family, and I told you our aunts used to come over. Now, that family had come from Germany in 1850. And they would come over to our house in the 1940s, and every Sunday we'd have dinner together. They were having trouble believing what was going on in Germany.
During the Second World War.
During the Second World War. They knew Germans were prejudiced against Jewish people because the Jewish people always want to get a hold of the money and they control things and and there was that understanding, but they could not believe that anybody in Germany could do what Hitler was doing in terms of trying to eradicate a whole race of people.
Now you listed an understanding. You said that they had a certain list of things that they assumed Jewish people were about.
Yeah, like they had their prejudice that they would identify, say, yeah, I never liked Jewish people too much. And we were living in a Jewish neighborhood at the time. But they could not get themselves to believe, and I'm talking about 1942, 43, 44, and we began to see Jewish refugees in our neighborhood and knew damn well these terrible things were happening, and it's still hard to believe. So I had seen that in terms of the family not being able to even believe them. We didn't have news then the way we do now. But my mind was saying, why? Why would people do that? And then later I learned homosexuals or people with mental illness, the same thing. They were taking them off to, they said, create a superior race. Well then, in a psychology class, I finally learned about this psychological mechanism of identification with the oppressor. And that helped me to understand, even to get a reason to why people would act like that, or why a whole group of people would act like that.
Now, you mentioned that the Ostendorfs left Germany. Why did they leave?
Bismarck's conscription. So I was honest in the peace movement, because Bismarck in the 1840s wanted every male to join the army, and not every male in Germany wanted to join the army. So some of them snuck off and came here. And that's what the Ostendorf family ended up settling in Delphus, Ohio. Now, how they got there, but I think it was Nova Scotia, Canada, Lake Erie. I went to Delphus once to talk with people, and they said it was woods all the way from Lake Erie all the way down to Delphus, but they found their way down there and settled in Delphus, Ohio. So, and that's why, that was the history of why the family came here. So I always felt like that justified my interest in peace. Although there were certainly members of the family who went into the military and I'm told served honorably and proudly.
Well,
in the United States, I mean.
So you identify, the ones that left, you identify them as being people who were leaning toward peace. And I'm trying to get your connection between that and identifying with the oppressor. So I'm trying to put those two pieces together.
Well, these were people who will take the side of peace, even against, say, public opinion or authority figures, won't identify with the aggressor. They have an internal compass that they follow. Mm-hmm. I'm like that. I identify myself like that. But there are other people, like, you know, if you yell at them, you know, how raising children, if you keep yelling, the father keeps yelling at them, he'll do, because he identifies with the oppressor. And that's how armies get formed and wars get won, and it's a psychological mechanism that happens when people are kidnapped. Survival says, I'm going to do what this man tells me to do. And it's a psychological mechanism that isn't saying, conniving, what I'm going to do because I want to survive. It's a mechanism that just clicks in. It's a survival mechanism, identification with the aggressor. And that really helped me to understand people who do these things.
Well, now that brings me back to the question of the impact of racism on the city of East Cleveland. And I remembered in the last time we sat down to talk, that you said there was a lot about East Cleveland that people used to be proud of. And what I understood about that, as I reflected on it, because I've been thinking about what you said too, East Cleveland was quite different then. And it sounds to me like, well, why don't you tell me how it was different then and how it is now?
Okay, I would compare it to Shaker Heights, Cleveland Heights, older community, this house is more than 100 years old. People have homes that are more than 100 years old and they're beautiful and people are proud of them. And
what was the racial component of East Cleveland in those days?
It was probably similar to Shaker Heights or Cleveland Heights.
What that means?
Probably at one time 10%, 20%, 30%. Probably when I bought the house here, it was, see, and there again, the schools I think were like half and half, but there were more white people who were homeowners at that time. And one of the things I want to mention about homeowners in East Cleveland, they told me with this house that they had just passed this new legislation about historical buildings. And they said this was a historical building and that I could just fill out the paperwork. And the paperwork was about 200 pages.
Yeah.
Well, that's been another factor in East Cleveland because I said, well, what's the advantage? Why should I fill out all these papers? I don't have time. And they said, well, you don't have to pay taxes, property taxes. And see, that's another one that's been a biggie in East Cleveland.
So are you connecting that with racism? Since
Yeah,
so
I
many people
am.
will not
It's
know?
called a free ride. It's people looking for a free ride. And
Most of those people were white homeowners?
yes. But it becomes an attitude about not taking ownership in the community or dissing a portion of your own city or dissing the schools and sending your kid to a private school or that kind of attitude. Now, I'm not saying that everybody that sends their child to a private school is dissing the community, but I think I saw that more here in East Cleveland.
In those days,
Yeah.
when you were buying the house. And what were the relationships? What did you see in terms of relationships between the black people and the white people who lived here?
Okay, on this street, that's all I can speak to, there was harmony. You know, and you get the white lady with all the cats, you know, you get that, but a high level of tolerance and not just tolerance, but goodwill, because there was goodwill had been done, you know, a history of goodwill and neighbors helping neighbors.
On this street?
On this street. Now there was a family across the street, I understand he's in Hollywood, he's a Hollywood actor. And there were stories about people and what they had done when they left. And
So this was in the
the
early
70s.
After some of the rioting that had happened on Superior.
Yeah,
So East Cleveland was morphing into a different kind of city?
I guess it was happening in myself or in people who were busy. I didn't notice it was even happening.
So even
But I will say this street to me has always been friendly and constructive. People feel good about this street, and you don't always find that on the many streets.
Did you socialize much in East Cleveland when you first moved here?
No, not the way we had in on 87th Street, where we made really intentional outreach. And the other thing that happened, I was working on the DSEG team, and I was working 12, 14 hours a day. So, and I had foster children. And that was another thing that happened with the foster children. I told you about the inspections. But they didn't want foster children in East Cleveland because they said the schools were crowded. Now, I was always able to make arrangements for my foster children to go, like Cheryl went with me to Collinwood because I worked there, and we made arrangements. So
But
they
East
didn't have
Cleveland
to.
schools would not take the foster children?
No, there was, no, not foster children, you gotta be kidding. I mean, even grandchildren, remember there was a federal, and that hostility.
A federal case?
A federal case that went to the Supreme Court, as I recall. And the hostility was palpable. That's the East Cleveland schools.
Was it race-based?
Well, if you live with your grandma, honey, and you know that's more of a tendency in the black community than it is, you know what I'm saying?
What I'm asking you specifically
Yeah,
is, was the
well-
school system racist in its avoidance of foster children? That's what I'm
Oh,
asking.
absolutely.
Cheryl, though, was a white girl.
Uh-huh.
That was a white foster child. I know you had children of all races, but there was no way that they would accept any of them.
Oh, it was like a battlefield. And it didn't hurt me as much as if they had been grandchildren. I mean, I had other options, if you know what I'm saying. But the grandmother with a child, and God only knows mom may be in jail or gone, you know, she's trying to get her kids in school. That became a federal district and went to the Supreme Court. And can you imagine what the poor grandmother went through? And she was just one of hundreds. And that hostile attitude didn't stop with the federal court decision.
What were they trying to accomplish by avoiding having foster children in the school system?
They said they had too many kids.
So.
And it's a small part of the pattern of hostility toward the children in East Cleveland that this school district has had, as I know it, since the late 60s.
And so you moved here in the 70s, and from what I can tell of your...
1970, I think.
Mm-hmm. And then you left, you moved away. I'd like to, let's see. So we talked about racism specifically. And we talked a little bit about how the city changed over time, but could you expand a little bit about how the city changed? I mean, what you saw as you were living here from, let's say, 70 to 1991 when you say you left?
There had been riots. Huff. And the Huff riot started, okay, in an area that abuts East Cleveland. And there was shooting on the streets and the National Guard. And a lot of people who could moved. And they moved to East Cleveland, many of them. So there was a shift, a population shift that was probably faster than it would have been had it not been for the riots that happened in the 1960s.
Now, you said you were living in that area during the riots. Did anything happen that sort of gave you impetus to move?
Yeah. Our house was firebombed. And as I look back on it, we weren't surprised. In other words, we had a bathtub full of water in case something happened, because we had heard about firebombs being thrown. And so the firebomb came into the living room window, and we grabbed it with blankets and ran to the bathtub with the fire. So we weren't hurt. There was another one at the side of the house. But we decided then that it was, and as I said, couple of the people were getting married and this and that and the other, and we just decided it was better to move.
Was your household white, or was it?
When we started, we were all white. There, at the ending, three of us were black.
Out of how many?
4, 5, 6.
Okay, so you moved from there. That's when you moved to East Cleveland. Now, I've noticed that when we talk about your time living in East Cleveland, we still talk so much more about Cleveland. So I want to ask, how did you use the city of East Cleveland?
Well, the housing piece was, to get housing.
So you lived here.
Rental housing. I might mention in that regard, the East Cleveland Library called me not long after we got here to Windermere, and they wanted permission to keep some of our poetry books. The books, we had some books published. We published some books from the poetry. And I just felt like I was
a published author. So East Cleveland Library, at least at that time.
At that time.
And we are hoping they still have them. Books of poetry that were written at the 87th Street House?
87th Street House and Diversity House.
And Diversity House.
Where the poets were hanging out, yeah. And that was I mean, that's positive outreach from the library. And I spent quite a bit of time there. Of course, I was right on the same street where the library is, but it was a very friendly place. And as I say, when they called me and asked me if they could put our books in the library, I said, oh, wow.
And that was when you lived on Windermere.
Mm-hmm.
Now, again, I will ask you, over the years, how did you use the city? Aside from just, you know, having a home here and staying here.
And using the library.
So you couldn't use the schools for the foster children. So how did you
And
use the
Lamonte
city?
lived here, but he went to Jane Addams.
So the foster children that lived here went
To
schools
Catholic
in
school
Cal-
or to Collinwood or to Crispus Attucks, or yeah, we managed other things. And I'm saying that because it was understood. The animus was palpable in the schools. People didn't want to go there, even people whose kids were supposed to go there. And I still see that up and down the street. The kids that help me in the garden.
Most of them go to other schools.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you did mention two of your foster children, Lamonte and Cheryl, but there were others too, weren't there? Can you describe a little bit about some of the others?
When Nicholas and Dell Fisher were also from a school that I worked at, which was Crispus Attucks Elementary School. And the principal, we were trying to get absent kids to come back in school, so I would make home visits and corral the kids and get them to come to school. I had my methods for making them just know they wanted to come. And that's where my shoes, you know, what do you need? I can't buy my shoe. You know, I mean, all those stories.
All
Well,
those
we'll get the shoes. Don't worry about it. Well, one of the homes I went to, I walked up several flights of stairs in an apartment building, and I knocked, and the kitchen door went open. It was wintertime, it was January, and the gas burners were on, all of them. And I'm saying, hello, hello, yoo-hoo, you know, my yoo-hoo, anybody here? And I heard some laughter. And I found the kids laughing at my yoo-hoo. They were under the kitchen table. And they wouldn't come. They said their mother told them, don't answer the door and don't go out with anybody. So I said, okay. Do you need anything? Are you, well, we're cold and we're hungry and this and, well, I said, I'll go back to school and I'll talk with the principal, and then I'll try to get back and talk to you again. So I went back and talked with him, and we called county, and county asked me to go back and get the children so that they could come and interview them. And I did. I told the kids, I got food for you, because I'd talked to the lunch ladies, and you know how lunch ladies can always rustle up some food. And I said, I got some socks and some duds you might want to like to wear. So the kids came back with me to school.
They were pretty young, weren't they?
Second grade.
Like 7 and 8 or 9?
Yeah. Maybe second and fourth grade. I think he was in the second and she was in the fourth. And the family, it turned out the workers were afraid of the family, the mother. The workers were afraid, not the family,
What
the mother.
workers?
The social workers. That's why they had me bring them back to school to interview, to talk with them. And of course they heard the story, and Mom hadn't been home in days, and the kids were cold and very hungry. And so here again, I brought them home here on what they called an emergency placement. And came to find out that they had older brothers and sisters who were in foster care. And later came to find out that one of them wrote a book about his life, and that was Antoine Fisher, Finding Fish. And then when the kids were much older, we were able to introduce them to their older brother. They had never met him.
I want to unpack that a little bit. So you brought the 2 children home on an emergency placement basis. And how did they adjust to being here with you?
Oh, we had a ball. They were sweet kids.
So
Now, I will say, now here's another example. You think the social welfare system is going to help. Emergency placement, they don't give any funding for that. So, and I had just finished graduate school. I was still trying to pay off some school loans. And I was having trouble getting enough food. I mean, kids eat, you know. So I went to the bank where I was supposed to, I asked for some food stamps. Oh no, we don't give food stamps for emergency placement. I said, we can't do that, says the social worker. So I went to the bank, and the people at the bank said, hey, how long are you going to have the children? And I said, I think only a couple of months, but that $250 I'm paying you would buy food. They said, don't worry. And there was no increase in the mortgage or this and then, you know, let us know. Now, it's that kind of thing you run into in life. That's the county you're doing them a favor by accepting kids, but they can't even give you food stamps. But the bank says, don't worry about your loan, just take care of those children, and when you can, you start giving. So, so I really went off the subject again. Go.
yes, because I want to talk about racism,
Mm-hmm.
and I know that you know some things, so I'm going to press for that information. With those 2 children, you were an emergency placement as opposed to a regular placement. Why?
Well, they have a meeting and they decide what to do. And I will tell you this, I liked them both a lot. They liked me. It was a good, and the young boy was 7. And he had some, I will say it looked like he might have some challenges. And I wanted them to keep the children together because these 2 kids needed each other.
Well, they were together. They were in your home.
Yes.
Why not your home?
Okay, I was thinking he might need a strong family, mommy, daddy type home as he moved into adolescence. So I accepted it as a emergency placement, not a permanent placement.
In those days, how often was it that black children were placed with white families?
Oh, I couldn't tell you. I don't know.
Do you think it happened often?
I don't think so, but I don't know. Black children with white families. I know it happened because I read about it in the paper. There was discussion about if this should be and if this should not be. And
did county ever have any pushback around black children being in your home?
not to my knowledge, no. No, we had very supportive social workers. They liked what we did, and no pushback to my knowledge. Now, the mother was kind of a holy terror. She was feared in the neighborhood. And of course, the kids were going to school, continued going to school there, and I'm working there. So a couple of times she came in the building, and she raised holy hell in the building, and they would just lock me in my office and lock the room where the kids were and wait for her to blow off her steam and go back, leave the building. So they finished the school year in June.
So that meant that they stayed with you for, what, 6 months, 8 months?
Mm-hmm.
Now, I asked you a little earlier how you use the city. And I've heard a lot about how you interacted with the city of Cleveland. So again, it's clear you didn't use the school system.
Avoided the schools, actually. Mm-hmm.
were there other?
Library was always positive experience. I had a library card and used it. The kids, we would go to the library to do homework. Every foster child, every kid I knew, I would take them to the library to work on homework and use resources there.
Were there other resources in the city that you used that were not directly connected to the fact that you lived in this house?
I can't remember that, no.
The Shaw Community Center? No. Okay, so basically it was kind of a bedroom community for you, meaning you come here to sleep. Why?
As I say, I was deeply involved in my work and in foster parenting, and our experience with the getting license for the housing was another very, very, very negative experience every time. I mean, I could tell you a few more stories. So you learn to start to be very careful. And I think it was when Nicholas and Dell were here, Niai and Iovi were upstairs on the third floor, and they wanted, the county wanted to come, the city had a social work department at that time. And you know, you hear the negative stereotypes about the social workers sometimes. These women personified that. And they wanted to go up to the third floor. And I said, you just can't, I haven't got time right now to take you all through the house. Come back next week, you know. Well, we had Niai and Iovi up there, and nobody knew it. I mean, they weren't official. They were Africans, they had children.
But they were permitted to be in the country. They weren't illegal aliens.
No, they weren't illegal aliens.
But the city code required them not to be able to live on the third floor. Is that? Now, your house is pretty big.
So they moved out for a week. They actually took all their stuff, I mean, and spent a lot of time packing and moving out, and then we boxed a lot of stuff and took it down into the basement so it would look like nobody was there so that the social workers can come back in. And they were that type.
So the third floor, your house is huge. The house is huge.
It's a good-sized house, yeah.
2 bedrooms and a full bath on the third floor.
And a living area.
Living room area.
And you can see the terminal tower out the window.
And the second floor with 4 bedrooms, and the first floor.
We had room.
You know, really big house.
I mean, you've met people who have lived here for periods of time, and
so,
I myself.
What was the problem with Niai and Iovi living in your home?
We weren't allowed to have, okay, now if you have a mommy and a daddy, you can have twice as many children. I don't know how they calculated it, but I wasn't a mommy and a daddy, I was just a mommy. So I could have 2 foster children here, but that's all. Well, honey, Lamonte was here. Niai and Iobi were up there with their children, and here I am running tag with the social workers. And no, there was no interest in bringing the children into the schools. It was just, again, the housing licensure. So it was like war.
And so you basically avoided the city. You lived here, but you avoided the city.
Now, like the people, like the shopping centers were fun, the library was wonderful, but those.
Well, now I've asked you a lot and sort of really probed you a lot about racism. I'm going to ask you now a more general question about other kinds of oppression. And I'd like to know how inequality of any sort that you think of has affected you personally.
Well, my mind goes to homophobia. And it's been an adventure for me
to get to know myself as a lesbian woman, woman. And a lot of my coming out to myself and to the world has been here on this street. And I can remember people wanted to see the house, you know, and so I bring them in, and then they want to see who is in what bedroom. And I think single women always get a little bit more curiosity from people who are married or widows, or, you know, had a regular family, and now they may be a man or a woman living by themselves, but they're curious about the other man or woman who are living by themselves or with an, you know, and it's homophobia. What I'm talking about is homophobia. And here on the street, I have watched people like me, I'm okay, friendly, so on and so forth, but they want to come over and go through the house. And that was also in the 70s. And I always brought them in and brought them to the house and showed them what they wanted to look at. And I was.
Were you out lesbian?
No, I wasn't.
Were you even in the?
I was a question to myself, is what I was. But people were curious, is what I'm saying. And on the street here, it was a friendly curiosity, never hostile.
I asked you about inequality.
Had I been an out lesbian, I don't know if I'd been able to go to college where I went to school. I don't know that. I don't know. And I think I have to say I'm not quite sure. There certainly is inequality, yes. And you get this thing with snobbery and such, but I'm not quite sure what you...
Did inequality ever affect you on your work and your job, your work?
I think that because my specialty was nursing, I don't think so. Questions, yes.
Well,
and I might say I was a good nurse. I was highly regarded professionally, so...
And during your time in the desegregation unit department?
I told you about the first interview.
Yes, I'm
Yeah.
talking about the work you did.
Yeah.
And your colleagues.
No, I think I feel as though maybe I'm not hearing you.
Well, we're talking about how inequality affected you with colleagues and associates who worked in the department. Well, not the department because you were a one-person department, but there were other departments in your cluster, right?
Mm-hmm. Or say in DSEG, or as a nurse. I don't think I was, when I was working, I'll make a comparison. The school district in Cleveland is miles ahead, for instance, from the courts or from this school district here in terms of trying to be egalitarian. Now, had I been working in another environment, I might have experienced inequality, yes, for sure. But I don't think I did in that environment.
Okay. See, as I look at this, at your list of activities, let's take a little break. Okay, before we took our little break, we were talking about the impact on inequality on your life personally, and you mentioned that the main kind of inequality that you were thinking of was homophobia. Can you unpack that a little bit and tell me a little bit more about what you meant by that?
Well, as I was developing myself, my own awareness of my own sexuality, I was keenly aware of other people's attitudes about being against those people, queers or homos or I was keenly aware of it, and I guess it made me kind of retreat into a shell of some kind.
Now, we probably should back up a little bit and talk about our own relationship, since that is the elephant sitting in the middle of this interview. Going back to your monthly gathering at work, can you talk a little bit about how you met me and how our relationship began?
Well, you came to do a presentation from Harambe Services to Black families, and you were working with one of the more difficult populations to work with, which was teen parents. A lot of people, teachers and school administrators and people just don't know how to deal with teen parents and you you were so lighthearted about it and easy, and as I remember thinking, you have such a high level of empathy, and I'm sure the kids, the students felt that. So I had great respect for you from the very first time you did a presentation for the Human Resources Network on how a community resource could come into the schools and help our children. And
that program was a real kind of an interesting one, because I think it was the first time in Ohio, or in Cleveland certainly, where we used the power of the camera.
Mm-hmm.
And you were talking about that earlier.
Mm-hmm.
This time we used videography
mm-hmm.
to let those young parents see how they were engaging with their children or not engaging,
mm-hmm.
and to see what effect that might have on the children.
Mm-hmm.
So it was an innovative kind of program in its day, but I thought I was totally struck. I'm stepping out of the interviewer role right now just to say I was really impressed with the gathering of people at your round table for that Human Resources Network, or what some people called a think tank, and the level of interest and diverse perspectives that everyone had, because they were coming at this problem of teen parenthood from different places, from different programmatic areas and disciplines.
That's right.
And that's what your program did.
And what happens is that we tend to see our role, be it as a rape crisis counselor or a teen parent counselor or a peace advocate or a Boy Scout or a Girl Scout, one of those organizational, or providing shoes or coats for kids, and to bring it all together and talk about how we can help get together and the synergy that in fact, I wrote an article about that once. It did not get published, and I named it Synergy because that I do strongly believe that bringing people together like that increases energy.
Well, how did the inequality, the issue of homophobia, impact on you as you were moving forward with in your professional life?
The homophobia, the only time that we talked about that, I think, in that think tank was when a student talked about how a gym teacher had helped him by allowing him to just use the gym teacher's shower and change area. But at that time, I don't think there were any services
two gay and lesbian children. Am I wrong about that? So they were just out there by themselves, or homeless, which is how I oftentimes found them. And I'd say, well, what happened? Why did you leave? I didn't leave. They told me I had to go. Well, why? Because I told them I thought I was gay. I heard that quite often and began to realize it was a problem. And there again, that was when I saw it. I don't think it's a new problem.
Is that what you meant when you said it caused you to retreat?
The retreat, the feeling of retreat came more from my peers or a director who would be like 100% down the line about the federal district court order and not being prejudiced about race, but on the other hand was so terribly homophobic. I mean, you know, it's like total hypocrisy. And it would make me shrink back because, one, the hypocrisy, and two, and the danger that poses to a person like myself. I can't agree with them.
Well, then talk a little bit about having met me.
Duck and dodge. I don't know how much but as a result of meeting you, I did decide that it was totally important to come totally out, be honest with myself and be honest with the world as an out lesbian woman. And probably had I not met you, I would have never done that.
And doing so, because, you know, I've heard people say, you can't be black without people knowing it, but you can be gay without people knowing it. I'm not sure that that's true, because there are some very light-skinned black people and Roman-featured black people. But coming out, then, there are always consequences to everything you do.
Mm-hmm.
What were the negatives, the positives, or were there any consequences to your being an out lesbian?
Well, because I don't have a lot of ambitions, like, you know, rising in the bureaucracy or making public life or politics, I didn't have a lot of negative consequences, like pocketbook-wise or job-wise. But certainly my circle of friends changed, and my energy went more into nurturing relationships with gay and lesbian people. Like when we talked about the Stonewall Democratic Organization, that we get quite a bit of energy to now.
And you serve on the board of that.
Mm-hmm. And it's an organization that requires, like CORE used to, it requires an action piece. You've got to do something, get out there and do something. In Stonewall Democrats, we interview people who are running for office. And that interview process is a powerful tool for change. I like it a lot. And I've learned a lot. And so had the people we interviewed.
Now, you mentioned the Cleveland Stonewall Democrats as an organization. I think that you listed it in the year 2000 and beyond as members and as board members. But there's also some activities that you engaged in through the women's community, women's music festivals. You did some training there. Can you talk a little bit about that?
The origins of racism? What I decided to do was just have circles and talk about where our racism comes from. And I suspected, because of my own childhood and upbringing, that probably we learn those attitudes from our family as we're growing up. And it was really interesting to hear people tell their stories. And we went around the circle and just told our stories.
And was this a mixed group? Racially mixed?
Racially mixed. I asked that we just have white people to come, because there's a tendency when black people are there to not want to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
was it? It was gender. It was one gender.
Yeah.
Also, right? All
White women. Hmm. And it was women who wanted to talk, who came to it voluntarily to talk about undoing racism. And in undoing it, what I explained is we needed to figure out where it came from. So let's talk about that. That's how I would usually start the discussion.
So back to inequality around LGBT or around lesbian issues. You said that it didn't impact on you in your pocketbook.
Unless you talk about inheritance and things like that,
Mm-hmm.
it didn't affect my employment. I didn't get fired or anything, and I know that happens.
Well, I do recall, and this is a point of personal privilege again as your spouse, I do recall some housing issues that we had because of our relationship. Would you like to share about that?
In Beechwood?
Here, when we first started living together.
Now I'm drawing a blank on that.
Okay, well, we can come back to it later.
The kids. The kids went to East Cleveland schools for a little bit, a few years. So we had the home inspection then too. See, it kind of blurs together for me because
Every encounter with the housing department
was negative.
Well, what about inequality's impact on the city itself, on East Cleveland itself?
It's certainly a piece of the blend. People moving here angry about what had happened to them where they came from, and it might have been Cleveland and it might have been Alabama, but bringing the attitude of hurt and injury with them. And wanting, I think finding certainly something a little better, but not everything they wanted. And I'm thinking, now when you talk about problems with government, I think there has always been a problem with the Cleveland Police Department.
Cleveland?
Cleveland.
Uh-huh.
And a lot of people who moved here from Cleveland had bruises from that Cleveland Police Department. I don't think the East Cleveland Police Department has had the systemic problems that Cleveland has. I don't think. Certainly, at a time when there was a primarily a white department and the fire department was white too, there were problems, but I think that it would be interesting to study to see how the police department and the fire department evolved as the city changed. But there has been some evolution, more so than I think what we see in Cleveland. Now, I may be wrong about that, I don't know.
Well, let me ask this question. You singled out homophobia as the inequality that you were focused on. Are there any other kinds of inequality that you're thinking of? Like perhaps class or gender?
Yeah, or economic inequality, because people who don't have money can't do. There's just a lot of stuff they can't do or can't do for their children. Economics is a tremendous problem. And we've had a city that's been getting poorer and poorer as more well-to-do people have been able to move out. They have done so.
So, the inequity of the haves and the have-nots?
Has created major problems in the city. I think crime, loss of population of the kind of people you might want to keep in a community because of that crime, or because of the city politics or the housing department.
Now, you know, the given that not only the economics of East Cleveland has changed, but also the racial component of the racial balance, let's say, of blacks and whites and others, has changed certainly since you've been here. How does it feel being a white woman who lives in East Cleveland at this point?
We moved back in 2005, and I have often thought what was helpful to me was that people up and down the street remembered us, and remembered us fondly. And that's a tremendous help. I can remember in the days in the 90s, pardon me, in the 80s, when I would walk down to the rapid transit, I knew most of the street people. There were street people then too, but I knew them as people who had lost their homes or whose children had been to my house for a Halloween party or something. I knew the street people. I don't know them now. But I know the people that live on the street. And that's a tremendous help moving into a city. I would like to encourage more people, more suburban people, white people, and black people, middle-class people to move back into East Cleveland. And I wondered about what can we offer them? I think neighborliness is a biggie. Certainly there are some excellent real estate buys for anybody who wants to take that jump now.
Why did you move back?
We were at a point, I was at a point in my life where I knew I wanted to retire from work. And working for me was, if I wanted to get something extra, I could do something extra at work and get some more money, you know, and that wouldn't be possible anymore. And for reasons of my own poor judgment, sometimes I had overextended myself. I bought a house for grandchildren and had this house for, well, relatives, and had a house that was not wise to keep anymore because the kids were gone and our parent, your mother and my mother, had both passed away. So we had to make a choice, try to bring it down from 3, 4, we had a double house too, and decided that we wanted to do something to make East Cleveland a better place and dedicate the rest of our lives to moving back in here and trying to help the city. So that's why I think, and as we have talked about, all these things are complex. I mean, there is not just one reason. I felt settled in this house. For some reason, I have always felt very comfortable. I love this house. I like it. And so we moved back.
And you said one of the things that might support having people who come in, who can come back to the city of East Cleveland to help strengthen it, is neighborliness.
Yeah, neighborhood linkages.
What have you done, if anything, so far to encourage that?
Well, I tried that with a neighbor across the street when they moved, new people moved in, and they looked at me like I was crazy.
And that's an overt offer of,
yeah,
hello,
can I bring you some food or
yeah.
something? Welcome. Can I bring, so that didn't work. But
I'm sure as time went by, I mean, we had looked each other eye to eye, talked to each other, knew who I was, gave my phone number, and
you've done some other things too on the street.
well, just exchanging phone numbers with all the neighbors helps. The volunteering in the garden, I'm going to mention the garden a little bit. We started a trash cleanup at the corner of the street where there was a large accumulation of trash.
Now, as I recall, that had to do with cameras too.
Well, we took pictures of it and put the pictures on an invitation to come and help us with the trash cleanup. And that in itself also was a very interesting experience. We said, don't bring the kids. And we said, don't bring the children because glass, syringes, condoms, we didn't know what was going to be there, drug paraphernalia. So just the adults, because we said, don't bring your kids to this when we're cleaning up the trash. And the city helped by making a special pickup after we had bagged, 100 bags, a whole lot anyhow. And
but the neighbors came.
oh, it was amazing how many people came early. I walked down there to set up, and I mean, a lot of people came. And with a few exceptions, men who said, oh, ain't nobody coming, they ain't coming. They'll laugh at you just trying to be. But both of those men have since become very helpful in other ways, very constructive ways. So it kind of like shows, as time went by, they became very constructive forces.
Now, one of the things that I heard in that, the naysayers, and there weren't many, actually people didn't say anything, they just came.
Mm-hmm.
Except for these couple of grousing guys. And
well, one of them came too, and he just stood there and said, I'm surprised. Well, I'm surprised. He didn't help or anything. He just stood there and said, with his new shoes, I'm surprised. You know.
And some of them said it would go back. Don't worry, you clean it up today, it's going to be right back. Has it ever?
It's tried to, and but I will say also, several people on the street do the same kind of pickup I do. Just walking down the street, just pick up a couple of things and keep on walking. And
the mound, the
oh, nothing
5.5 or
like
6
nothing,
foot high
nothing,
mound
nothing
never
like.
returned.
And then we moved on to developing a garden down there to make it really beautiful, and it is beautiful in the summertime.
Now, say a little bit about the garden.
Well, it was an evolution. They took a building down, and then I tried to move some of our plants and little baby trees and that, and the ground was so clayish, I couldn't even dig down there. But I kept trying. And then I heard, I think, from you about Windermere Renaissance, which is a not-for-profit organization. And I joined their board when I retired just because I had the time, and I said, let me see if this may be a way we can help. And they expressed interest in helping develop a garden down there.
Now this isn't a food garden.
No, the mayor said that was what the city owned the property then. And the mayor said no food, but if you want to put a garden down there, that's fine. And of course, we want to honor the mayor's request, so we started planting flowers. And after a couple of years, we had to get a fire hydrant permit. So here I am, 70 years old, learning to work that fire hydrant and irrigation and hoses and.
Now you said we. So talk a little bit about who the we is that maintains the garden.
Well, Windermere Renaissance, a couple of their board members helped, and Huron Road Hospital volunteers. I mean, like 30 or 40 volunteers helped us in the very beginning when we got a couple of truckloads of soil, and the Huron Road volunteers, and again our street club, So we had probably 50 people down there. Case Western has sent some students to help. I don't think it's Case Western exactly. It's maybe a fraternity or a department. Huron Road is gone now, so we need volunteers.
But there are also
children
and parents.
Yeah, and I found that when I was going down there to plant or do something, the kids would kind of like follow me down there. And then I'd pick up something and say, "Ooh, that's a bug." And I'd say, "No, that's a seed." "Ah, that's a bug." So we get into these, then we'll say, "Well, let's put a little dirt on it and then watch and see what happens." And then the kids would really get excited about things coming up. And the sunflower in particular, which got bigger than they were. And that's amazing to see in a couple of weeks something gets bigger than you are. So I said, I heard about this organization that was doing neighborhood grants.
Well, now, you're speeding up this story a little bit. When did this start?
The trash cleanup was probably in 2006, this summer.
And then the backhoeing and putting the soil down for the building?
Maybe 2007 or 8.
And so since 2008,
We've been planting
you've been planting
and learning.
and children followed you.
Yeah, and so I decided to try to write a grant that would enable us to take a group of these kids. See, and the other thing is they felt ownership. That's what I really, really liked.
And the parents
And
followed
they
you
said,
too.
yeah, and they said, when I asked them in the beginning about planting there, they said, and I talked to people who walk, they said, please put a pathway in, because people walk down there to the rapid. Probably, maybe 100 people a day. It could be that much, I'm not sure, with all the school children. And so we put a pathway in that curves a little bit, so when you walk to that in the middle of the summer, when the birds are there and the flowers are blooming, it is very beautiful and very peaceful right here. And the comparison between when they were selling drugs and prostitution and that at that corner, and then to walk through that garden now, it's beautiful. But the other beautiful part is if you're working down there, I say if I have an hour's worth of work to do, I really need to give it 2 hours, because people stop and talk. And they want to tell you about their grandchildren, or how they're trying to get a job, or one woman was telling me that she was a school board member and she was going to bring her mother down here, and sure enough, she had got her mother, where they live, I don't know, but she brought her mother in a wheelchair, you know, to see the garden.
And so this garden,
School board president, no, the council president brought her father to see it. He was really impressed.
so you have this garden, and it's called the Page Avenue Garden. A good portion of it, the longest part of it, actually sits on Euclid Avenue, the shorter end. But that takes the place of a building that was large enough to have 3 or 4 stores in it.
Mm-hmm.
So we're talking a pretty good sized property, maybe 170.
Yeah, 120 at least. I'm not exactly sure.
By 70 or something
60
like that.
or 80.
60,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. And how on earth, I mean, you have children that have been coming since 2007 or so
Mm-hmm.
to help you. But there are also, other folks that lend a hand from time to time. Now, you said that you wrote a grant, but that was just last year.
Mm-hmm.
How did you finance it before the grant? And what does the grant finance?
Okay, well, we financed it. Okay, I tried planting down there a little bit, and it really wasn't working. And then I joined Windermere Renaissance. And they are organized through the local Methodist Church to bring betterment to East Cleveland, green betterment. And they wanted to do the straw bale house or the low maintenance housing or organic gardening, which is what we now have, the two gardens, one Mayfair where there is food in the garden, and this one where it's just flowers at the request of the mayor. They financed, what did it cost to get started? Probably $300 for a load of dirt and probably a couple of $100 for some bulbs and some flowers, plus donated stuff. And Huron Road, when their people came, they brought flowers. So we had some bought flowers and some bought and some brought. But I would say the whole thing was certainly less than $1,000 to get it up and running. And it's like the difference between day and night when you look at an abandoned area with, wine bottles and bags from McDonald's, and then a year later you're looking at a bunch of flowers. It really does make a big difference.
And neighbors also donated flowers?
Oh yes, one of the people who had said, "Nah, ain't nobody coming to clean up," has since donated close to 100 plants. That it's an amazing turnaround, and he's very proud of his plants and what we've done with them.
Now, children come down to help, and the ages of these kids were what?
Okay, the children, we wrote a grant to the...
Before the grant?
Before the grant, well, the kids had seen me going down with a shovel or something, and they just, one or two would follow me. Not consistently, but like I say, we'd have the conversation about, is it a bug or is it a seed? Or where does that come from? And there's a butterfly, and look out for the bee, and playing, and water.
What's the age of the youngest child?
The youngest child, when he started, was, I believe, 3.
And the oldest one?
Is now 19. So when he started, he was probably 16. And the boy who was 3 is now 6, I think. And because of the grant, we were able to have them go through a process of weeding, seeding, feeding, irrigating, so they would see the growth process in their little area to make it theirs. So we also call it the Page Avenue Garden, but the Children's Garden. We want them to feel a sense of ownership.
And that was just done last year?
Last year was the first time. Asked them to come 15 times for an hour's work, weeding, seeding, or 30 times for a half an hour, and then go back and write about it, or put a picture in the book, or draw a picture. And then, of course, we used photography to show them dramatically holding the hose, or the girls opening the fire hydrant, or something. They were very proud of the pictures, and they put them in their book. So all of them have authored a book now, all 9 of them. And they're all proud of that. And one of them, the older boy, did Google Earth, and he had Google Earth, because they all took their own form, but every one of them did a book. So we have 9 book authors on our street. How many streets can make that claim?
Can you recollect a memory or instances when the community actually fought for something?
Well, I'm proud of the way they're coming. I see people picking up trash, and I call that fighting for something. I think on this street, I'm not sure we have a collective foe, anything to fight. But what we are doing is doing more constructive stuff, and I'm optimistic that our street property values are turned around and our street has gotten to be a healthier place than it was. To make collective action, what we do with the kids' reward then, we give them a stipend in August so they've got some money to go back to school with for clothes or for school supplies. And
that's our street, and you're thinking of our street as the community. Do you have a more expansive view of East Cleveland as community?
Yes, because people have come, not just women, but I'm thinking of a woman that lived up Euclid Avenue, and she owns her property. She and her husband own the property, and they wanted to buy the lot next to them to start a garden. And I thought that was quite dramatic, that somebody would want to, but they'd been watching us. And then they wanted to buy a property to develop a garden on.
I hate to interrupt this, but I hear your puppy crying, so we might want to take a break. And have the puppy walk a little bit, and then come back.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, when we left off, the puppy was barking. So I think the last question I asked was about if you can recall any instances when the community itself fought for something.
In East Cleveland. Well, yes, one rather recent one was the decision of the community to have the mayor only get paid for one position. And I say that about the fighting piece of it because up and down Euclid Avenue in October and November, they were passing out these little squares that said no to. And I asked somebody, what does it mean? And then somebody referred me to somebody else who was the owner of the gas station where I was. Oh yeah, he said, that's the politics, the mayor. You want him to get 2 paychecks or 3, you vote yes, and if you don't, you vote no.
So someone asked, you were asking, like, what is this about?
Yeah,
mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Can you think of other instances where the community as a whole fought for something? Or against something?
Trying to think now. When the decision to have a mayor, I understand, was hotly contested, I think we were not here then when that got handled or got decided. But we weren't here then.
Well, you mentioned the closing of the hospital.
That was the most impassioned thing I've seen. And it was sad and almost sacrilegious because the Cleveland Clinic was not about to hear it. I went to all the public meetings. And they were not about to hear it. They had hired their planners and told them what they wanted to do.
But did the community fight about it? Because that's the point.
Oh, you mean within themselves? No, against. They had community meetings. We had a press conference on Terrace. There were 4 or 5 different community meetings, and all to no avail. And ironically, not long after they closed the hospital, they had this shooting of 3 youngsters. And had this hospital been open, those 3 kids might not be dead today. Because when you take 3 gunshot wounds to the same emergency room, they life flighted them to Metro. It's too much to handle. I don't care how good they are. But if they could have taken 1 or 2 of them here to Huron Road, we might have 3 young people still with us. I don't know, but I'm speaking with emergency room experience.
Mm-hmm.
But
the community did
mobilize, yeah.
Were you a part of that mobilization?
I would say so, yeah. I hadn't remembered that or thought of it that way, but that's true. The whole community, the whole city, people who had been born there or had children there or been taken care of there, it was passionate. And the employees were proud of that place, especially the emergency room people.
How have surrounding institutions and cities impacted on East Cleveland?
Well, one is, as I mentioned, after the Huff riots and the changes that took place in Cleveland, and also the desegregation in Cleveland, caused people to move to East Cleveland because they didn't want their kids bused to the west side, so they moved to East Cleveland where they could keep their kids in the neighborhood schools.
You mentioned that you were a Case student.
Mm-hmm.
Has Case University, for example, been one of the institutions that have had an effect in East Cleveland?
I have no doubt about it. There's money and there's personnel. Just looking at the Windermere, at the transit line, those hospitals and the Case Western Reserve University has impact on East Cleveland.
How?
They bring some money here. They've started to invest. They've got some apartment buildings on Euclid Avenue now, and hopefully they keep going with their march east down Euclid Avenue. They hire people from East Cleveland. East Cleveland people work in the hospitals and at the university, like Mr. Llewellyn did. And they're good employers. They give people housing vouchers. It's kind of nice.
Are there any negative impacts of these institutions on the city?
Case Western negative impacts. Well, the Green Police, I think, sometimes bring transient people into East Cleveland and drop them off. I've seen that happen.
By the Green Police, you mean?
University Circle Police. That may or may not be in agreement with the East Cleveland Police. I don't know what kind of agreements they have, written and unwritten. I think there could be a lot more done. And when our mayor was elected, I wrote him a letter offering, to be on a committee to look at ways that the city and the university could cooperate. But I think it was a powerful letter. I don't think he must have read it, or he would have been on the phone right away.
Well, and the other institutions, let's see, what are the institutions that are in the neighborhood?
Well, as you said, Huron Road Hospital was a biggie because it employed like 850 people. The banks are the businesses, and I'm going to say the Key Bank is a big one because it represents money and it represents financial prowess. The Walgreens drugstore, I hope, is able to stay since the hospital has closed. There certainly will be a change, both to the bank and to the Walgreens because of the closure of the hospital, but they're still here now. And then the other businesses that are commodities selling family value and
those are businesses and institutions
yes,
in the city.
Yeah, and
I'm asking right now, and we'll get back to those institutions and businesses in the city, but I'm asking about the institutions and cities that surround East Cleveland. How do they impact positively and maybe negatively on the city itself?
East Cleveland neighbors also Cleveland Heights. Cleveland Heights, I think their police, because of their policing, they tend to move criminal elements in our direction here in East Cleveland. And I don't know if that's by intention or just a byproduct. But I've heard people say, you know, we'll have our gunfight in East Cleveland because the Cleveland police would arrest us before we get our guns drawn.
You mean the Cleveland Heights Police?
Cleveland Heights Police, yeah. And I'm sure that's not an intentional, that's a byproduct of the court system and the police in Cleveland Heights. I mean, I'm sure it's not intentional, but it happens. That they push things and undesirable events into our community. We border with South Euclid, and I'm not too aware of what goes on that border because it's far enough away from here. I think there's a beautiful asset that we have, which is parks, and I'm not sure who controls what parks, but I think it'd be a marvelous thing to try to consolidate the parks in such a way as, even with bicycle paths, I think that East Cleveland, one of our really beautiful assets are the parks and the cemeteries. And if we could make bicycle paths through the cemeteries and the parks, and specific roads like along through McGregor, and I don't know if that's a private road up there or not, but I think that Belvoir Boulevard, the valley there is beautiful. There's a lot that we could do that I don't think we've even thought about yet. And I'm mentioning it both as something that we have within, but also the Metro Parks is outside too. And if we could coordinate all that and bring some thinking to, as I said, bicycle paths to help people stay in shape, that would be wonderful.
What's your vision for the future of East Cleveland?
Well, as I just mentioned, coordination of public and private lands for landscaping, for bicycle paths, for neighborhood street parties and such. Then there are areas of the city like the Euclid Avenue. We don't use it as, we don't manage it. It's not managed as a unity, as a corridor. What we're doing is driving people away from Euclid Avenue with these traffic cameras and such. And there should be a way to attract, to bring in, to keep clean, to offer incentives to come and visit.
What would, if you were a person who didn't live in East Cleveland, what would attract you to move to East Cleveland? What is not present now but could be present that would attract you to come to East Cleveland?
Well, as you may remember, a couple of months ago there was an article in the paper about a family that had moved in and they had chickens. Somehow this family was invited to move into East Cleveland and they seemed quite happy to be here. And in my mind's eye at the time, I thought it might be a property abutting the cemetery, but I am not sure. But I think that, again, I would start with the parks, and then I would form a think tank, like I had with the schools. And from the parks, move to some of these, we still have some beautiful old buildings, and try to make them available. Now, Jeff Johnson, to his credit, is doing this in Cleveland, trying to make housing available or make it interesting to people to come and look and see what they could do. And we know we've had a couple of houses on this street that have been rehabbed and are now inhabited by, by the people who bought the property. So it can be done, and I'd start with a think tank. And I want to mention another thing. When I was a graduate student at Case, whenever I've been in school, I've always had part-time jobs, and the library is always my first choice for a job, because you can do library work and get some study and homework done too. At the library, I was able to use their computer before they were readily available, before the laptops were available. Library closed at midnight. I would get on my bicycle and come on home here. I never had a problem. And now that was in the 70s. Never had a problem coming home at midnight. Of course, going in the morning, that's kind of like rush hour. But
that's during the time you were a student, graduate student. But what was the stated or unstated policy of the university at that time? About coming into East Cleveland?
Oh, they told people don't go beyond the bridge. They did tell people that.
You think that's still being told?
You'd have to be there. I don't know. I know what I heard at the time.
And what was their reason for not going beyond the bridge?
Safety. And I can remember at a meeting saying that I rode my bicycle back and forth every day. It wasn't fully appreciated, but it was the truth, And the reason I used my bicycle, I had a car, but it's so expensive to park there, and then you get tickets, and then the green police are after you, and then they hold up graduations if you got tickets. So I just basically, as 9 times out of 10, I took the bicycle.
So that's one way in which an institution surrounding the city of East Cleveland impacted on East Cleveland, sort of gave it expressed that it was a bad area.
Now, a word about other businesses. I talked about a think tank. What we call a shrimp boat down here is a business that makes money and pays taxes. And I think they try to be good neighbors. I went in there one time and asked them to set out some garbage cans so that people coming out of there didn't throw bottles and cans in the garden. And they were cooperative with that. They put out some kind of a garbage container. And I know they probably spoke with people. And then, but there are businesses. The piano company is a gem in our community. We need to figure out how to incentivize that. Now, as any piano this community library or church has bought should have been from that piano company. If it wasn't, we should apologize and say from now on, we're going to do everything we can through our churches and our libraries and our schools to make use of this piano. It's a gem. It's a gem. The theater there is another gem that needs some revitalization, it needs some rehabilitation. I understand they have to get their 501c3, but it's a theater, and you and I remember that Khalil acted there, and we were there every night and very proud of the theater, and the kids that were in that, there were only about 10. It wasn't a child's play, but the young people who were in it were very proud to be there, and I'm sure we'll never forget it. That little theater is a gem that we need to hold on to. And I could kind of like march right down the street and talk about some of these institutions now that we need to hold on to and support and keep their sidewalks clean and that kind of stuff. It's very hard to walk in East Cleveland. We need to keep our sidewalks safe and clean, especially on Euclid Avenue, but all of our routes to the schools, and keep the kids off the street. But especially if you want to make friends with the businesses, keep those sidewalks clean for them.
Or if the businesses want to make friends with the neighborhood, they can keep their own sidewalks.
I'm thinking, and again, I'm going back to think tank, because many heads make for good ideas and synergism, and well, I bet we could get some funding for that. And I bet, you know, the judge could, you know, when you get vote heads together, people get ideas. And I would start a think tank to just work on some of those, get going on some of those ideas.
Well, tell me about the major issues that need addressing in order to better your community, your neighborhood, and the city as a whole.
Okay. What, as I said, the idea of a think tank to start figuring out how we can coordinate things. My comments on this might be somewhat controversial, but my observation has been that people in government here, government jobs, whether it's the housing department or the social service inspectors or even some of the elected people, tend not to want to give and enhance the community, but to suck up and take. And somehow we have got to turn that around to where our elected officials and our employees want to give to the community. I'm not quite sure how you do that. And I guess that's sometimes the role of an inspired leader that will catch on like that and turn a city around. It's happened. And we need that. The politicians, and of course people will say, well, it's economics, and you need to budget, and you need to, we need state oversight, and we need this, and what, all that may be true. But also to get in the head here, the mindset to give to the community and not be taking from it. And I'll go back again to when I was buying this house, and they said, well, you can get the license. And I asked what that would give me, and the guys that were talking to me, they were real estate people. Well, you don't have to pay taxes. Well, I said right away, if that's all it is, I'm not going to fill out all these papers, because I'd never been to public schools in my life, but they're important. I want to pay taxes. You know, that's where most of our tax money, I want to pay taxes, you know. But I'm afraid we have a lot of people in this city, historically, who don't want to pay taxes, who feel like that would be an unjust burden on them.
Well, historically, what about today? Because so many of the citizens of Cleveland are renters, and you know, so they don't pay tax on houses. But you know, there are other ways they contribute.
Yeah, and that's why I say we need a think tank.
So I heard you say that one of the major issues that you would like to see addressed is public servants who actually understand that they are to give to the city and to inspire giving to the city. Can you think of some other major issues that, now that you know East Cleveland is in a state of fiscal emergency?
Well, yes, I can think cooperation with that, and cooperation and a good spirit towards it. But we also need to get that synergistic leader who will pull people together and say, okay, let's pick ourselves up and get moving in a positive direction to here. And make people welcome to come back, tell people we want to come back to East Cleveland. You know, Shaw High School, some of the great Jewish leaders, in fact, Morris Sayre, who started the Shoes for Kids, he went to Shaw High School. He loved to talk about Shaw High School. He loved it. We need to bring some of these people back. I mean, I don't mean actually those people. I mean, maybe their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren, or because it's a great time to get a good deal on an old house and play that up for all it's worth. Because I can remember you and I going to a couple of the neighbors' houses in Beechwood and thinking, God, these bedrooms are so small, you know? I mean, these old houses really do have something. But there again, you need to be able to advertise it and look at it and see the potential, not the problem. And it takes a certain type of people to do that, to make a garden in a wasteland. Did I get off the subject again?
Well, I'm looking, you're a solutions-oriented person, and I appreciate that. I'm also looking at what we should find solutions to. So one of the things I heard is a need to have leadership that are giving leaders, not merely receiving leaders. You mentioned earlier about the schools. What do you think, are there any major issues related to the schools or the library or the other larger institutions of our city?
Okay, I think if we get dynamic leadership wanting to turn the city around, I suspect that dynamic leadership will begin to get its old heads now that are in that they've been here forever, that are now on the library and the school boards. And they'll be replaced by the same type people if we can get it turned around. You know, like we turned our street around just by addressing trash in a very physical way. That happens socially too. If we can start to get it turned around and get some new leadership in.
Well, we have two fairly new school buildings.
The Shaw High School and the Heritage Middle School. Mm-hmm.
But in terms of summertime, what happens with the children then?
Interesting, they had a lunch program at the library, but not at the schools. I don't know. Now, I think about Cleveland. There is a policy, 1853, which is for human resource utilization. And then the staff can go and begin inviting community resources in, be it the lunch program, the breakfast program, the shoes, the sports mogul, the music mogul, to bring enrichment, the NAACP with the contest that yes, bring them into the schools, exhibit our kids. We have kids that are going to college and getting scholarships. Bring them up, show them, you know. And then that starts the turnaround too. That's the kind of stuff we need to do. I'm off the subject again. What did you ask me?
I was talking about issues that, major issues that impact the city. And I guess
See, when we get leadership turned around and get some of these old heads out, the excitement can start to come in to make the schools, to show off what we have that's fine and beautiful. And same with the library and our street clubs. And we can turn it around and then bring new leadership in.
So basically one of your major issues, or the major issue, is leadership.
Mm-hmm.
What about money?
I can't pretend to be an expert in that. I know we need to bring money in. That means businesses up and down Euclid Avenue and Hayden. And that means we do need police protection. This argument about we don't need police, we do need police. We need people moving in, buying old homes, fixing them up and moving in. We got some beautiful old homes. We need to get people, then when they come in, they pay taxes, and we pay a regional income tax out of East Cleveland too, so that would help. We certainly do need money, there's no doubt about that. Although I'm not an expert in the area, I know that those two things would help getting more businesses into the city and having people come in, rehab homes and move in.
If you were trying to entice people to come in, either to have a business in East Cleveland or well, let's start with the business. What would you provide for them that would make them want to come?
Well, the Chamber of Commerce has a few ideas, and I think that's worth looking at. I don't know what we can do. I think it's worth looking at. I don't know what, like I say, this is not my area. I would also want to
The
talk.
Chamber of Commerce in East Cleveland?
Okay, if that's not an option,
Is that what you're saying?
I would look to the state to see if we can get some tax breaks and or some state money in here.
To provide incentives.
Yeah, building things again, and I think that our main industry at this point should be turning around some of these buildings and not letting them just fall and get dilapidated, or worse yet, like what the school district just did. They're spending thousands and thousands of dollars to demolish a building that some people were interested in rehabbing as a historic. Yeah.
Tell me about that.
Well, we had brought people through. There was some interest in rehabbing beautiful old house that is owned by the school district, was used as a drug-free center or something before they abandoned it. So it had become abandoned and the school district still owned it. And there were people, but they weren't going to lay out a bunch of money to buy it. But the school district could have given it to one of these not-for-profits to rehab. But instead, for some reason, not entirely clear, they are spending thousands of dollars to demolish the building.
And then what will they do with the land?
Put poles around it, probably. Maybe some good soul will start a flower garden there. But it's a beautiful, have you been in that building?
Tell me the name of it again.
I can't right now.
Is it the Gill building?
The Gill house.
Gill house?
Gill, yeah. And Gill was a man who came here to help build the Terminal Tower. When I say help build, he was an architect or someone from a family of Irish innkeepers. And they were working in the Terminal Tower, and they had this house for people who were working on the tower when it was being built. So it's an old house, about the age of this one. And why we have to spend this is it, the school board's good money to tear it down when there were companies out there that would have worked on rehab if it had been given to them.
Well, we're coming close to the end of our discussion, but I have one very important and salient question for you, and that is, what are you prepared to do to participate in making East Cleveland better?
Well, the idea of the think tank, I like that. I would like to be a part of it, to just brainstorm ideas and try to bring some money in here and some muscle and some new ideas. I want to keep the garden going. There's a program that I wrote up that I would like to see in the schools called Dream a Lot. I want the kids to look at a vacant lot that's filled with trash and dream what they would like there, and have a contest and offer $100 to 4th, 5th, and 6th graders from around the school. I'd like to do things like that. Those good ideas I have it written up. Mm-hmm. Those good ideas tend to get squashed. I think we could find money to do that. Dream a lot. Dream a vacant lot into something very beautiful, or a vacant house into something very beautiful. That's what I would like to, the vision right now. That's what we need. Some people to come in and help with that bring that kind of energy that want to do that. Not because they want to make some money, or they want to avoid taxes, or they want a second or third paycheck, or whatever, but because they want to give something to East Cleveland, to the community, give something back.
Well, I want to thank you very much for participating in this interview. I know it's been long, and it's been really quite enlightening to me. Even though we share a home and we live together, I've learned a lot about you. So I appreciate your sharing. And as you know, the Voicing in Action project is one that will take these ideas and use them and try to build, increase the value of community by using your voice.
I hope so.
So again, I thank you.
Voicing in action.
Yes.
Thank you.
Did you have fun?
It was good.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, it's 1853 page.
I'm looking now in your dining room and I see a painting there. Can you tell me a little bit about this painting?
My grandmother, dear Minnie McNerney, who came from Canada in the 1800s, was a part-time artist. She liked to draw. And I'm told that some of the stuff she did was really good. And this is one of her, she liked to draw flowers in particular. And there's a plate upstairs that we have of a little girl sitting in a chair in a farmhouse knitting. And that was what she called a self-portrait.
But she painted this one?
Yes, she painted this one. And I love it. So I've hung on to it through the years.
It is quite beautiful. You have some other items here. I'm going to just take a shot of a couple of other
Yes, she had a
paintings.
water, this was oil, I believe, and I think that was watercolor over there. And she did that as she aged. She got terrible rheumatism, but she kept painting watercolors. And that's one of the hundreds that I've been able to hang on to.
So I'm going to try to find my way over there.
And she painted this china, and so you see G on the china, and that's because that's for her married name, which was Gear.
I'll try to zoom in. I'm not sure we can get it, capture it, but, well, there it is. There's the G. And the plate there?
She painted all that. She painted all that.
So this, your grandmother was quite the artist.
She was, yes. She was an industrious person.
And you enjoyed her work.
She was wonderful to be with. She told me about all the little people, where they hide.
The little people meaning?
The little people, the elves. And you see, and I still like long curtains. You know why? I like the long curtains because the little people hide behind them.
Well, I'll try to get a shot of the watercolor. It's behind me now, and I'll pause the camera and turn it around
Okay.
so we can get a shot of that. Thank you for sharing with me.
Thank you.
Your home,
Thank you. Thank you.
your life,
Thank you. Ideas.
and ideas.
That's what's priceless. If we could just get some of them moving, that would be a wonderful thing.
Well, thanks again.
Thank you. And
Okay, so this is the watercolor that you were commenting about, Mary?
yes, my grandmother was probably in her 70s when she did these watercolors.
And that was with arthritis in her hands.
Mm-hmm.
Quite beautiful.
I would soak her hands in paraffin and then she'd paint for 10 minutes. And I'd soak her hands in paraffin and she'd paint for another 10 minutes. And that's how that got done.
And you've been able to save these and cherish your grandmother's paintings and keep them in your home,
Mm-hmm. Our home.
our home. Thank you again.